She came with nothing, and they made sure she knew it. The moment Eliza Vane stepped off the stagecoach onto the main street of Blackstone Valley, Margaret Holt, wife of the wealthiest cattleman in 3 counties, looked her up and down like she was inspecting a lame horse at auction. Then she turned to the women beside her and said, loudly enough for half the street to hear, "Good Lord." He sent for a bride and got a scarecrow. The laughter came fast and mean. Eliza stood there, holding her worn suitcase with both hands, dressed dusty from 2 days of travel, hair loose from a braid she'd tried to fix somewhere around the last river crossing. She didn't look away. She didn't cry. She just stood there absorbing it, the way you absorb cold water, letting it hit her, letting it pass through, not giving it the satisfaction of a reaction. That moment on the street? That was the moment everything in Blackstone Valley began to change. This is your first time finding this channel, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the stories we tell here don't end where you expect them to. Like this video and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The stagecoach had been running 3 hours late out of Millhaven, which meant Eliza Vane had spent most of the afternoon pressed against a cracked leather seat beside a traveling salesman, who smelled of camphor oil and talked without stopping about the superior quality of his boot polish. She had smiled at appropriate moments and said almost nothing, which was a skill she had developed early in life and refined through necessity. She was 24 years old. She had 31 cents in her coat pocket, a suitcase containing 2 dresses, a wool blanket, a small folding knife her father had given her when she was 12, and a letter. The letter was from a man named Colton Rourke, written in a hand that was more functional than elegant, offering her the position of wife on a working ranch in Blackstone Valley, Colorado Territory. It was not a romantic letter. It was direct and factual, which she had actually appreciated. He needed someone capable. He wasn't looking for decoration. What Eliza had not anticipated was that the town would form an opinion about her before she ever said a word. Blackstone Valley was the kind of frontier settlement that had pulled itself up from raw earth and never quite forgiven the effort. The buildings along the main street were solid but graceless: a general store, a land office, a hotel with a sagging porch, a post office that doubled as a telegraph station. The people who moved through it had the particular bearing of those who have survived enough hard winters to stop being impressed by strangers. Margaret Holt stood outside the dry goods store with 2 other women, whose names Eliza would not learn until later: a Mrs. Pratchett, wife of the banker, and a woman everyone called Adeline, who had married into the 2nd largest cattle operation in the valley and never stopped reminding people of it. These 3 women had apparently made a habit of watching the stagecoach arrive, which, in a town with limited entertainment, was perhaps understandable. But the way they watched Eliza step down suggested they had already made their assessment before her boot touched the ground. "Is that her?" Adeline said, not bothering to lower her voice. "The mail-order girl Colton's bringing in?" "Must be," said Mrs. Pratchett. "Lord, look at that dress." Margaret Holt was the one who delivered the line about the scarecrow. She said it with the specific confidence of a woman who has never once been on the receiving end of that kind of comment and genuinely cannot imagine why it would sting. Eliza had encountered women like her before, not cruel exactly, just so thoroughly insulated by comfort and social position that cruelty didn't register as cruelty to them. It registered as observation. The laughter moved through the small crowd that had gathered near the post office steps. Not everyone laughed. An older man near the livery kept his eyes on the ground. A young woman with red hair and a flour-dusted apron pressed her lips together and looked away. But enough people laughed that the sound of it followed Eliza as she picked up her suitcase and walked toward the hotel. She did not look at Margaret Holt. She did not respond. She simply walked. Inside, this cost her considerably more than it appeared to. The hotel was called the Valley Inn, a name that suggested more comfort than it delivered. The room she was given had a single iron frame bed, a washstand with a cracked basin, and a window that looked out onto the alley behind the building. She set her suitcase on the floor, sat on the edge of the bed, and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of feeling everything she had been holding since the stagecoach rolled into town. It wasn't humiliation. She had felt humiliation before and knew its particular texture. This was something closer to exhaustion, the deep bone-level tiredness of someone who has been proving themselves to skeptical audiences for so long that the prospect of having to do it all over again, in a new place, felt like a physical weight pressing down on the top of her skull. She had come from Harlan County, Kentucky, which was not a place known for producing women of leisure. Her father had been a coal miner who died of a lung condition when she was 16, leaving her mother, Eliza, and her younger brother Cal to manage a situation that had very few good options. Her mother had taken in laundry and sewing. Eliza had worked at a dry goods store, then a boarding house, then as a cook for a logging camp for 2 years, which was where she had learned that you could be competent at difficult things and still have people treat you like you were invisible. Cal had gone west 3 years ago to try mining in Nevada. He sent letters that were increasingly optimistic and increasingly sparse, until 6 months ago when the letters stopped altogether. She didn't know if he was alive. She had written to the last address she had for him and received no reply. Her mother had passed the previous winter. Pneumonia, fast and merciless. After the funeral, Eliza had sat in their small house, which would need to be vacated by the end of the month because it had always been rented, and tried to map the options in front of her. There were not many. She could stay in Harlan County and find another domestic position, which would keep her fed but not much beyond that. She could try to find Cal, which meant money she didn't have for travel to a territory she didn't know. Or she could respond to the advertisement she had seen, pinned to the post office board 3 weeks ago, placed by a man in Colorado Territory seeking a capable woman for ranch partnership and marriage. She had stared at that advertisement for a long time. Then she had written back. Colton Rourke's response had arrived in 11 days. It was 2 pages. He described the ranch, 8,000 acres in a valley between 2 mountain ranges, cattle operation, 2 ranch hands, a cook who came 3 days a week, and a house that was functional if not refined. He described what he needed: someone who wasn't afraid of hard work, who could manage a household and potentially keep accounts, who understood that frontier life was not comfortable and had no romantic illusions about it. He said plainly that he was not a man who was good at company, that he had been managing alone since his wife died 4 years ago, and that he was not looking for sentiment, just someone to build something practical with. She had read that letter 4 times. The lack of pretense in it was, oddly, the thing that convinced her. She wrote back accepting. Now she was sitting on an iron bed in a hotel that smelled of old wood and pipe smoke, listening to a loose shutter bang against the side of the building, trying to remember why this had seemed like a reasonable decision. Colton Rourke arrived the following morning. She heard him before she saw him, a brief exchange in the lobby below. A voice that was low and carried without effort, the kind of voice that didn't have to try to fill a room. She had been at the washstand when she heard it, and she took her time finishing before going downstairs, not out of vanity, because she had learned that walking into rooms unhurried gave you a moment to read them before anyone could read you. He was taller than she had expected. That was the first thing she registered, that, and the fact that he looked like a man who had been weathered by something as more specific than just years. There was a particular kind of stillness about him, the kind that doesn't come from being at ease, but from having learned to manage what's going on inside. He was standing near the front desk with his hat in his hands, and he turned when she came down the stairs, and for a moment they just looked at each other. "Miss Vane," he said. "Mr. Rourke." He didn't offer a compliment or an apology for the conditions or any of the social lubricant that people usually reach for in uncomfortable situations. He said, "I heard what happened yesterday when you got off the coach. I'm sorry about that. Margaret Holt has more money than sense, and she's been that way since before I can remember." Eliza looked at him. "You don't need to apologize for her." "I'm not apologizing for her. I'm acknowledging it." He held her gaze steadily. "There's a difference." She decided in that moment that she was going to give this a real attempt. Not because he was impressive or particularly warm, because he wasn't especially either of those things. Because he had bothered to acknowledge something he didn't have to acknowledge. And, in Eliza's experience, that was actually not as common as it should be. They ate breakfast at the hotel dining room. He ordered black coffee and eggs and didn't make conversation for the sake of it, which she found genuinely restful. She asked him about the ranch, the specific questions, the practical ones, how the water situation was, whether the fencing was in good condition, what the cattle numbers looked like going into the season. He answered each one directly, and she could tell from the slight shift in his posture that the questions interested him, though he didn't say so. What he did say, when she asked about the accounts, was, "They're a mess. I'm a rancher, not a bookkeeper. Everything's written down, but it's not organized in any way that makes sense." "I can fix that," she said. "You know accounts? I kept books for a boarding house for 2 years. And before that, I worked with the logging camp manager on their supply records." She paused. "I'm not a trained accountant, but I'm careful, and I don't make the same mistake twice." He nodded once, which she was beginning to understand was his version of a considered response. After breakfast, he took her to the ranch in a wagon, and she spent the ride watching the land the way the mountains sat at the edge of the valley, like patient witnesses, the dry grass that had the particular color of a Colorado autumn, the thin line of cottonwood trees along the creek that marked the eastern boundary of the Rourke property. It was hard country, beautiful in the way that hard things sometimes are, but it didn't flatter you. It asked something of you. She had always responded better to things that asked something of her than to things that offered ease. The ranch house was exactly as described: functional, unpretentious, built to last rather than to impress. There was a large kitchen, a main room, 3 bedrooms, and a back porch that looked out over a stretch of pasture. She walked through it while Colton waited in the doorway, not hovering, giving her space to form her own assessment. She came back to the main room and said, "It needs work. I know. The kitchen floorboard near the stove is going to give out by spring. And something's wrong with the drainage on the west side. You've got water damage creeping up the base of that wall." He looked at the wall, then at her. "You got all that from one walkthrough. I grew up in a house that had more problems than money to fix them. You learn to look." Something shifted slightly in his expression, not quite respect yet, but its precursor. The thing that comes just before someone updates their assessment of a person they thought they had already figured out. The first real test came 3 days after she arrived, and it didn't involve Colton. It involved his ranch hands. There were 2 of them, a man named Dex, who's in his 40s and had been with the Rourke operation for 6 years, and a younger one named Petey, barely 19, who had come on the previous spring and was still establishing himself in the particular pecking order of ranch labor. Dex was not actively hostile, but he had the manner of a man who had gotten used to a certain way of doing things and was not interested in that changing. Petey took his cues from Dex. On the 3rd morning, Eliza came out to the barn at dawn to help with the feed rotation, not because anyone asked her to, but because she had watched the morning before and could see that the current method was taking longer than it needed to. She had a different way of organizing the sequence that would cut the time by roughly a third. Dex watched her work for about 2 minutes. Then he said, "That's not how we do it." "I can see that," she said, not stopping. "I'm showing you how it could be done. Nobody asked you to show us anything." She stopped then, looked at him. "You're right. I'm not asking permission. I'm doing a job." The silence that followed had some weight to it. Petey glanced between them like he wasn't sure which way this was going to go. Dex said slowly, "Mr. Rourke didn't say anything about you changing the barn work. Mr. Rourke told me to make myself useful," she said. "I'm making myself useful." She held his gaze without aggression, but without retreat either. "If you have a problem with the method, tell me why it won't work, and we'll talk about it. If you just have a problem with me, that's going to need to get resolved some other way." He didn't answer her. He turned away and went back to the feed, following her sequence without acknowledging that he was doing so. She finished the work and went inside without saying anything further. She stood at the kitchen window afterward and let her hands shake slightly against the sink edge for about 30 seconds. Then she made coffee and started on the accounts. The accounts were, as Colton had said, a considerable mess. She spread everything across the kitchen table: ledger books, loose receipts, folded papers with numbers written in margins, 2 years' worth of livestock records that were organized by color of the animal rather than by date or category, which suggested a system that made sense to whoever created it and no one else. She worked through 2 full afternoons and most of one evening, building a structure, cross-referencing entries, flagging inconsistencies. On the 2nd evening, Colton came in from a late fence inspection to find her still at the table. 3 candles burned down to stubs around her. A fresh ledger open in front of her with 2 years of transactions reorganized into something that could actually be read. He stood at the door for a moment. She said, "Without looking up, your supplier in Millhaven has been overcharging you on winter grain. Not dramatically, but consistently. About 3% over the going rate every order for the past 18 months. He came closer, looked at what she'd put together. "You sure?" "I checked it against the price records at the general store here. Garfield keeps his going back 4 years. She pointed to a column. "It's not enough to be obvious in any single order. But across a year and a half, it adds up to a meaningful amount." Colton was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, studying the ledger. He had the expression of someone recalibrating something they thought they already understood. "I trusted that man for 8 years, he said, not angrily. "Just stating it. He probably figured you weren't checking the math. "I wasn't." She looked up at him then. "You are now." Word had a way of traveling in Blackstone Valley. It moved the way water moves through dry ground fast, finding every available channel, going further than you'd expect before you even noticed it was moving. Within a week of Eliza's arrival, the version of her that existed in the town's collective understanding had already formed its edges. She was the mail-order girl. She was the scarecrow Colton Rourke had imported from somewhere east. She was either evidence of his eccentricity or his desperation, depending on who you asked. What traveled more slowly was the other version the one Dex grudgingly mentioned to a hand at the neighboring Patterson Ranch, which was that the Rourke woman had reorganized the whole barn operation and found a pricing problem in the supply chain that Colton had been bleeding money through for over a year. That version moved more slowly because it required people to revise something they had already decided, and revision is always more difficult than initial judgment. Margaret Holt heard the first version and not yet the second. She invited several of the valley's prominent wives to a gathering at her home, a large stone house at the north end of the valley, that she referred to as a residence, and everyone else privately called the Holt Fortress, specifically to discuss, among other things, the question of Eliza Vane. Eliza knew nothing about this gathering, but she would learn about it soon enough, because the frontier had a way of making sure everyone eventually learned everything. And because what was said in Margaret Holt's parlor that afternoon would determine, in ways Eliza could not yet anticipate, exactly how difficult the next several months were going to be. She was at the ranch that afternoon, reorganizing the supply room, when she found something unexpected, a second set of records, tucked behind a loose board in the bottom shelf, in a different hand than Colton's. She pulled them out and looked at them for a long time, trying to understand what she was reading. And gradually, as the light faded outside and the evening birds began their business, she understood. Someone had been systematically diverting cattle from the Rourke herd for at least 3 years. Small numbers, spread across different seasons, disguised in the record keeping, as losses and illness and sales that had no corresponding receipts. Whoever had done it knew the operation well enough to hide it in plain sight. Eliza sat there in the dim supply room for a long time, holding those papers, feeling the particular weight of a problem that is larger than you expected and more dangerous than you're prepared for. Then she stood up, straightened her dress, and went to find Colton. Because some things, when you discover them, you can't unknow. And some fights, she had learned, find you before you're ready for them, which was simply another way of saying that this was the frontier, and it had never once waited for anyone to be ready for anything. Colton didn't say anything for a long time after she showed him the papers. He stood in the supply room with the hidden records spread across the shelf in front of him, reading each page slowly, going back twice to entries he'd already read. The way a person does when they understand what something says, but keep hoping the meaning will change if they look at it again. The single lantern she'd lit threw uneven shadows across his face, and she watched him work through it, the confusion first, then the arithmetic of it, then something harder that settled into the lines around his mouth and didn't leave. 3 years, he finally said. At least, some of these entries go back further, but the handwriting changes. So either whoever did this took over from someone else, or they got more careful as they went. He turned one of the pages over, checking the back, as though there might be something written there that explained it away. There wasn't. How many head? Across 3 years conservatively, somewhere between 80 and 100, spread thin enough that any individual season looked like normal attrition. She paused. Whoever did this knew what normal attrition looks like on an operation this size. They knew your records well enough to hide inside them. He set the page down. Didn't speak, that means, she said carefully. It's someone who had access to your records for a long time. Either a hand or someone who came into this house regularly. The silence after that was different from his usual silences. Those were the silences of a man who processed before he spoke. This one had something sharp inside it. Dex has been with me 6 years, he said. I know he's not. He stopped, started again. Dex is a hard man, but he's not a thief. I'd stake this ranch on it. Eliza didn't argue that. She also didn't agree with it, because she had been watching Dex for a week and had formed her own impressions, and she understood that the most useful thing she could do right now was not tell Colton Rourke, who she suspected, but let him arrive at the right questions himself. She said, there was someone before Dex who had access to these records, and someone else entirely who benefited from where those cattle went. Those might be 2 different people. He looked at her. The lantern light caught the exact moment he understood what she was suggesting, that this might be larger than one disloyal hand, that there might be a buyer, a receiver, someone in the valley who had been absorbing stolen Rourke cattle into their own count for 3 years and was still doing it. He picked up the papers and carried them to the main room. She followed. He spread them on the table, and they sat across from each other and went through them again, more slowly this time, with Eliza pointing out the patterns she had identified and Colton filling in the context she didn't have, which seasons had been harder, which periods he'd been away from the ranch for days at a time, which years the weather had provided convenient cover for losses that now looked less accidental. They worked through most of the night. Not because they solved it, they didn't. Not that night, but because neither of them could put it down once they'd picked it up. At some point, she made coffee without asking, and he drank it without commenting. And somewhere around 2 a.m. he said, without looking up from the ledger, you found this in 3 days. The records were already in a shape where something like this could hide. I was just reorganizing, and it fell out. Nobody else found it in 3 years. She looked up. Nobody else was reorganizing the records. He met her eyes then. Something passed between them that was not romantic and not simple, more like 2 people recognizing that they were going to be in something difficult together and acknowledging that fact without dressing it up. We don't tell anyone yet, he said. Agreed. Not Dex. Not Petey. Nobody in town. Especially not anyone in town, she said. He nodded. They went back to the ledger. Margaret Holt's gathering had taken place on a Tuesday. By Thursday, its effects were visible in the way certain women at the general store happened to finish their errands just as Eliza arrived, and happened to find reasons to be elsewhere. Mrs. Pratchett, the banker's wife, was the most efficient about it. She had a talent for social snubbing that was almost architectural in its precision, the way she could restructure the physical space of a room so that you were outside it without anyone having to say a word. Eliza noticed. She was not a person who missed these things. She had grown up in a community where social standing was communicated entirely through implication, and everyone understood the code, and Blackstone Valley's code was not significantly different from Harlan County's, just executed with more expensive clothing. She bought her supplies and said good morning to the ones who couldn't reasonably avoid her and didn't force anything on the ones who could. Garfield, the general store owner, was a small, wiry man in his 60s who had apparently decided that whatever the women of Blackstone Valley had chosen to do with their social architecture was not his concern, and he treated her the same way he treated everyone, which was with efficient courtesy and minimal commentary. On her way out, she nearly walked into the young woman with the red hair she had noticed on the day of her arrival, the one with the flour-dusted apron, who had pressed her lips together and looked away when the laughter started. Up close, she was younger than Eliza had thought, maybe 20, with freckles across her nose and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she had not yet learned to make it less direct for the comfort of others. "You're the one who came for Colton Rourke," the young woman said, not rudely, just stating it. "I am Eliza Vane Nora Hess. My family runs the feed operation on the South End." She shifted the basket she was carrying. "I saw what Margaret Holt said to you when you got off the coach. Most people did." Nora looked at her steadily. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything." Eliza looked back at her with equal steadiness. "You don't owe me anything. We'd never met." Still, she seemed to be working out whether to say something else. Then she said it. "Margaret Holt doesn't speak for everybody here. She thinks she does, but she doesn't." She paused. "I just thought somebody should have told you that before now." Eliza studied the young woman for a moment. Then she said, "Would you like to walk with me to the wagon? I could use the company." Nora fell in beside her without ceremony, and they walked together down the main street in the particular way of two people who have recognized something in each other, but are being careful not to make assumptions about what it means yet. The rival ranchers moved faster than she had expected. By the second week, two of them had made it their business to visit the Rourke Ranch under various pretexts, one about a boundary marker that needed rechecking, one about a water usage agreement from the previous year. Eliza was at the ranch both times. She observed that the visits were less about the stated reasons and more about taking stock of the situation, which meant taking stock of her. The first man, a broad-shouldered rancher named Virgil Patterson, whose family ran the second largest operation in the valley, arrived on horseback with two of his men and spent 20 minutes in conversation with Colton near the fence line, while Eliza worked in the kitchen garden she had started cleaning up. She could see them from where she worked, and she could see Patterson's eyes traveling to her and away, traveling back, the calculation behind them. When Colton came back inside afterward, she asked, "What did he want?" Said the east boundary marker might have shifted. "Wanted to walk it. Did you?" Told him we'd schedule it. She kept her hands in the soil. "That boundary marker hasn't moved. I've been over that fence line twice this week." He stopped. "When did you walk the east fence?" 2 days ago, and again yesterday. I was mapping the water flow from the creek to see where the drainage problem on the west wall might originate." She looked up. "Patterson's knows where his boundary is. He's been ranching that line for 15 years. Colton was quiet for a moment. "Then, so what does he actually want?" "To see whether I know what I'm doing, and whether you're going to let me do it." She went back to the garden. "He wants to know if there's a weak spot in the operation, now that you've brought someone new in." The silence behind her had a particular quality she could tell. He was deciding whether to be bothered by her analysis or simply to accept it. He accepted it. She heard him go back inside without arguing. The second visitor, a man named Clara Whitmore, who ran a mid-sized ranch and supplemented his income through some unspecified arrangements that everyone seemed to know about but no one discussed directly, was more interesting. He came on a Friday afternoon when Colton was out on the far pasture, and he spoke to Eliza directly at the front door with the easy familiarity of someone who has decided in advance that a woman in her position will not be difficult to manage. He was perhaps 50, with a carefully groomed mustache and the kind of smile that arrived a half-second before it should and departed a half-second after it should. "Miss Vane," he said, as though they were already acquainted. "I heard you've been settling in. Wanted to come by and extend a neighborly welcome. Mr. Whitmore." She had learned his name from Nora, who had offered an unprompted briefing on several Valley residents during their second meeting at the general store. "Mr. Rourke is out on the pasture. I can let him know you stopped by." "Oh, no hurry." He made no move to leave. "Actually, it's a fine thing to meet you directly. Get a sense of who you are." "Is it?" He smiled again. "Blackstone Valley is a close community. People look out for each other. Take an interest." He paused. "It must be quite a change for you. Coming from where was it? Kentucky?" "Yes. Quite a change. Ranch life isn't for everyone. It takes a certain kind of person to stick with it." Another pause, calculated. "Some folks find they've overestimated their fit. No shame in that. Better to figure it out early." She looked at him with the particular expression she had developed over years, of dealing with people who were saying one thing and meaning another, not hostile, not warm, just clear. "Is there something you'd like to tell Colton when he gets back?" "I'm happy to pass along a message." The smile thinned slightly. "Just neighborly interest, like I said. I'll let him know you came by." She maintained the expression. "Have a safe ride, Mr. Whitmore." She closed the door, stood with her back to it for a moment, then went back to the account books, because the best response to someone trying to rattle you was usually to return immediately to the work they were suggesting you couldn't do. She told Colton about both visits that evening. She gave him the facts without interpretation first, then her read on it when he asked. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to appreciate about him. A lot of men would have jumped in to explain or defend or minimize. He just listened until she was finished, then sat with it. "Whitmore," he said, "you thought it was worth mentioning specifically. He came when you were out. That was deliberate. And what he said about overestimating fit, he was testing whether I'd be easy to discourage. Are you?" She looked at him flatly. I walked fence lines in October before dawn because I wanted to understand the drainage problem on your west wall. What do you think? Something almost moved in his face. Not quite a smile. She was not sure yet what Colton Rourke's smile actually looked like, but its distant relative. I think you're not. They sat in the kitchen with the account books between them. Outside, the wind had picked up, the kind of cold October wind that came down off the mountains, carrying the specific promise of a difficult winter. Candles moved with it, even through the closed windows. She said, "There's something else about Whitmore." He waited. She opened the account book to a page she had marked. In the records I found behind the shelf. 3 of the cattle notated as losses in the fall. 3 years ago, the documentation on those is different from the others. The numbers don't match the standard marking system your other records use, but they do match the marking systems I've seen on the Patterson and Whitmore boundary agreements. She turned the book toward him. I think someone was preparing these specific cattle to move to a different operation, and I think whoever received them would have needed to re-register them. Colton studied the page. His jaw was tight. You're saying Whitmore might be involved. I'm saying the numbers make me want to know more about where those specific cattle went. She folded her hands on the table. I'm not accusing him. I'm saying the question needs asking. Asking that question in the wrong way, he said slowly, is going to make a powerful enemy. You may already have one, she said. You just don't know it yet. The wind hit the side of the house. One of the shutters banged. Neither of them startled. The gathering Eliza had not been invited to bore its first visible fruit on a Saturday morning at the post office, where 3 women led by Adeline, who had apparently been deputized for social operations that were beneath Margaret Holt's direct involvement, confronted her about what they described as her presumptuous behavior toward the established customs of the valley. The specific charge, delivered by Adeline with the pleasant tone of someone discussing the weather, was that Eliza had been rearranging Colton's ranch operation in ways that undermined the established agreements between operations, that she had been asking inappropriate questions at the general store and the land office, and that she was generally creating an impression of someone reaching above her station. This last phrase, above her station, was delivered with particular emphasis. Eliza had been collecting a letter from the postmaster when this delegation arrived. She took her time folding it and putting it in her coat pocket before she responded. Which agreements have I undermined? She asked. Her voice was even. Adeline blinked. She had clearly expected either retreat or anger and had prepared for both. Calm specificity was a different problem. The general understanding among the ranching families about how matters are handled. I'll need you to be more specific. Which agreements between which ranches and how exactly have I affected them? You've been asking questions at the land office that are inappropriate. I asked to see the public record of water rights filings for this district. That record is public. Anyone can see it. Eliza looked at her steadily. Was there something in that record you'd prefer I hadn't seen? Adeline's pleasant expression developed a small crack. That's not your twisting what I said. I'm asking you to be precise. Eliza kept her voice level. Not aggressive. Just clear. If I've done something that actually caused a specific harm to a specific person, I'd genuinely like to know about it and make it right. But if this is about the fact that I'm asking questions you'd rather go unanswered, that's a different conversation. The 2 women flanking Adeline exchanged a glance. You're very confident, Adeline said. The pleasantness had mostly gone now. For someone who arrived here with nothing. I arrived with a working mind and a willingness to use it, Eliza said. That's generally enough. She said good morning and walked out. Her hands were absolutely steady. Her heartbeat was not. But that was a distinction no one else needed to know about. Nora Hess found out about the confrontation before Eliza got back to the ranch frontier. Telegraph moved fast and appeared at the Rourke gate the next afternoon with a jar of apple preserves and the expression of someone who has just confirmed a suspicion they had been hoping was wrong. Adeline Marsh came after you at the post office, she said, handing over the preserves without preamble. I survived it. I heard you handed her her own head. Nora did not look displeased about this. I asked her to be specific. She didn't care for it. Eliza held the door open. Come in. I'll make coffee. Nora came in and sat at the kitchen table with the ease of someone who decided quickly whether she was comfortable somewhere and acted accordingly. She looked at the account books spread across the table, the maps Eliza had made of the water drainage, the supply lists with corrections marked in the margins. You're not what they were expecting, Nora said. I know. Margaret Holt told her circle that you were a desperate woman who'd married for security and would be gone by spring when the work got hard. She paused. She said it with that tone she uses, where she's being generous, about someone she's actually cutting apart. Eliza poured the coffee. What do you think? Nora considered this with a directness that Eliza was beginning to genuinely like. I think you found something in those account books that worries you. And I think whatever it is, it involves someone with enough pull in this valley to make your life very difficult if you go at it wrong. Eliza set the coffee cup in front of her, sat down across from her, studied her. Your family's feed operation, she said. You deal with most of the ranches in the valley? Every working ranch within 20 miles buys feed from us at some point, mostly spring and before winter. Do you keep records of quantities and delivery dates? Nora's eyes sharpened. We do. Going back how far? My father keeps everything. He's kept records since the day he opened. She looked at Eliza steadily. What are you looking for? Eliza was quiet for a moment. The question was whether to trust this woman, who she had known for 2 weeks, with information that could be dangerous if it reached the wrong ears. She ran the calculation quickly, the way she had learned to do, not perfectly, never perfectly. But she had a reasonable read on people, and Nora Hess read as someone whose word meant something. I'm looking for evidence of cattle that were never officially registered as arriving, but were being fed, she said. Extra stock appearing in feeding quantities, but not in official head counts. Nora was quiet for a long time. If someone was absorbing stolen cattle into their operation, they'd have to feed them. And the feed records would show it, even if the registration records didn't. Yes, another silence. You're talking about a ranch in this valley that's been receiving stolen Rourke cattle. I'm talking about a possibility. I don't have enough to know yet. Nora picked up her coffee cup, held it in both hands. She was thinking hard. Eliza could see it. Not frightened or not only frightened, also something else. The particular look of someone who has been waiting for a reason to do something they already wanted to do. I'll need to talk to my father, she said finally. And you cannot tell anyone I'm looking into this until I've had time to go through the records. Not even Colton. Not until you're ready. You have my word. Nora nodded. Drank her coffee. Looked out the window at the pasture where Petey was leading horses in from the field, the mountains behind him turning purple-gray in the afternoon light. There's something you should know, she said, still looking at the window. About Whitmore. Eliza waited. 3 years ago, before you came, before most people were paying close attention, Whitmore tried to buy out the Hess feed operation. He offered my father a decent price, but the way he structured the offer, we would have had to give him first right of refusal on all feed sales, which means every rancher in the valley would have had to go through Whitmore to get feed. She turned back from the window. My father said no. 2 months later, our storage barn burned down. Kitchen was quiet. Was it investigated? Eliza asked. Sheriff said it was a lantern accident. Nora's voice was flat. We'd been running that operation for 9 years without a single fire. My father is meticulous about lanterns, but the sheriff at the time was, she stopped. Chose her words. He had certain friendships in the valley. Where is that sheriff now? There's a new one, man named Arden. He's been here about a year. Jury's still out on him. She paused. But he's at least not obviously in anyone's pocket, which is more than we could say before. Eliza filed every piece of this away, with the methodical care she applied to the account books, not jumping to conclusions, not building a narrative out of half the evidence, but marking it, categorizing it, waiting for the shape of the whole thing to come clear. Thank you, she said, for telling me. Don't thank me yet. Nora stood up, smoothing her skirt. This goes where I think it might go. Thanking each other is going to be the least of what we're doing. The moment that changed the visible dynamics in Blackstone Valley arrived on a Wednesday, and Eliza had not anticipated it, which was rare for her because she was generally good at anticipating things. It happened at the autumn, gathering a semi-formal event hosted alternately by different valley families, at which the ranching community and the town's merchants and professionals came together for dinner, and the negotiation of social positions that happened in the spaces between polite conversation. Colton had told her about it with the expression of a man who finds these events useful but not enjoyable, and asked if she wanted to attend. She said yes, not because she wanted to, but because she understood that being absent would be interpreted as retreat. She wore the better of her 2 dresses, which was still significantly plainer than what the Valley women wore to this kind of occasion. She had no illusions about this. She was not going to impress anyone with presentation. She would have to do it some other way or not at all. The gathering was held at the home of a family named Colehurst Large Landowners, who had been in the valley since before most of the current settlers arrived, and who occupied a position of quiet authority that was different from the Peace Holt variety, less aggressive and more entrenched. The house was warm and crowded, the kind of gathering where everyone claimed a corner early, and the conversations were half social and half business, the way frontier communities always operated, because in a place where survival was still a living concern, pleasure and practicality were never entirely separate. Eliza stayed close to Colton for the first 20 minutes, reading the room, identifying who deferred to whom, who watched who without appearing to, which men gathered near the fire, and which positioned themselves near the door. She was doing this so quietly and systematically that she was fairly certain no one noticed. Then Margaret Holt crossed the room toward them. She came with a group Adeline, Mrs. Pratchett, and 2 men Eliza didn't yet know. The approach was unhurried and deliberate, the way a woman who has never lost a social engagement moves toward one. Colton felt it before he saw it. Eliza watched his posture change slightly, a bracing that was barely visible but there. Margaret Holt stopped a few feet away and looked at Eliza with the particular expression of someone who has had time to prepare their performance. "Well," she said, her voice carrying in that particular way that assured nearby conversations would quiet. "Mr. Rourke, I see you've brought your project." The word landed with precision, not wife, not companion. Project. Eliza felt the room's attention sharpen around her. She saw in her peripheral vision people turning subtly, conversations pausing, the specific alertness of a crowd that smells conflict. And then Colton Rourke, who did not raise his voice and did not perform, and was not a man given to speeches, took one step forward and said, clearly enough for the entire room to hear, without sounding like he was playing for the room, "Her name is Eliza, and if you have something to say to my future wife, I'd ask you to say it directly rather than sideways." Margaret Holt blinked. She had not expected that. Most people, Eliza suspected, did not expect things from Colton. "I was simply," Margaret began. "I know what you were doing." His voice was still even, still quiet. But there was something in it that the room recognized, because the room got very still. "You've been doing it since the day she arrived. I've let it go because I thought it would run its course." He paused. "I've changed my mind on that." The silence stretched. Then he turned to Eliza and said, in almost exactly the same tone, "Would you like something to drink?" She looked at him. He was looking back at her, steady and unperformed and entirely serious. She said, "That would be fine." They walked together to the far side of the room. Behind them, Margaret Holt said something that Eliza didn't catch, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the sound of the room beginning to breathe again, and the quality of the looks that followed them, not all friendly, not all convinced, but shifted, changed, requiring a new adjustment. Nora Hess appeared at Eliza's elbow a few minutes later, holding a cup and wearing the expression of someone containing a strong reaction. "That," she said quietly, "is the first time I've seen someone leave Margaret Holt standing with nothing to say since approximately 1879. Eliza glanced at Colton, who was talking to one of the Colehurst men with his usual economy of expression, apparently unaffected by what had just happened. "He didn't do it for effect," she said. "I know," said Nora. "That's what made it work." Virgil Patterson found Eliza on her way to retrieve her coat later that evening. He was quieter than she'd expected up close, the broad-shouldered man who had come about the boundary marker. The performance was absent here, the calculation she had seen from a distance reduced to something more direct. "Miss Vane." He stopped her in the hallway with a presence rather than words. A moment she waited. "Colton's a good rancher and a decent man," Patterson said. "I've known him 15 years. He paused. "I want you to understand that whatever happens in this valley over the next season, my concern is for the stability of all the operations. Not just mine." She looked at him. "That's a careful way of saying something. It's an honest way of saying something." His eyes were measuring her without hostility. "You've been asking questions at the land office. About water rights. About registration records." He paused again. "Those are the right questions. I just encourage you to be thoughtful about the order in which you ask them, and who sees you asking. She held very still. Are you warning me or advising me? Both, he said. Then he nodded once and walked away. She stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the party sound, continuing in the other room, turning over what he had just said. Not an ally, not an enemy. Something more complicated than either, which in her experience was usually the most useful and the most dangerous kind of person to have near a situation like this one. She got her coat, found Colton near the door. They rode back to the ranch in the dark, the mountains invisible but present above them, the cold air carrying that particular sharp note that meant the season was about to change decisively. He said, when they were most of the way home, Patterson spoke to you. He did. What did he say? She told him. Colton was quiet through it, and quiet for a while after. Then he said, Patterson's been in this valley a long time. He knows where the lines are. He knows where the danger is, she said. That's different. The ranch gate came into view ahead of them, the lantern she had left burning in the window, a small orange square in the dark. She had started doing that, leaving a light in the window without thinking about it, and had only recently noticed it was a habit. I found something else today, she said, before we left for the gathering. In the registration records from the land office, the public ones. He turned to look at her. There's a block of cattle registered to an operation I can't locate on any of the valley maps. The paperwork is correct. The filing fees are paid. Everything looks right. But the operation itself, the brand, the location claim doesn't correspond to any actual ranch I can identify. The wagon slowed slightly as the horses felt the familiar approach to home. A ghost ranch, Colton said. A name on paper, she said, with cattle registered under it that have to be physically located somewhere. He pulled the horses to a stop at the gate, sat there for a moment. How many head? Enough, she said, that it would be a significant number on someone's real count if they were being absorbed into an existing operation. The lantern light in the window was steady and warm, and very far from enough. The mountains were dark above the valley, and the cold was coming in earnest now, the kind that meant business. We need to be careful how we move from here, he said. I know, she said. Someone has been doing this for 3 years without getting caught. That means they're patient, and they're not careless. And they have enough of a position in this valley that nobody's looked too hard. He was looking at the window, at the light she had left burning. If they figure out we're looking, I know, she said again. He turned to look at her. In the dark, she could see the outline of him, the particular stillness that was his alone. The weight of a man who had been managing something very large and very alone for 4 years, and was only now beginning to recalibrate what that meant. You're not scared, he said. It was not quite a question. I didn't say that, she held his gaze. I just don't let it stop me. He looked at her for another moment. Then he got down from the wagon, came around to her side, and offered his hand to help her down. It was a practical gesture. His hands were calloused, and his grip was solid, and there was nothing performed about it. But it was the first time he had offered it without being asked. And they both noticed, and neither of them mentioned it, which was the only way it could have happened between two people like them. She went inside. He put up the horses. The light in the window kept burning. Nora came to the ranch on a Thursday morning with her father's feed ledgers wrapped in oilcloth and an expression that meant she had not slept well. Eliza saw her coming from the kitchen window and had the coffee ready before she reached the door. Nora came in, set the oilcloth bundle on the table, and sat down without taking off her coat, which told Eliza she was still deciding something. My father knows I took these, Nora said. He didn't stop me. But he didn't help me either, which means he's scared and trying to stay out of it, while also not being the person who blocked it. She looked at the bundle. I understand why. He's got the operation to think about. And after the barn, she stopped. You don't have to explain his reasoning, Eliza said, or defend it. Nora looked up. I'm not defending it. I'm just explaining where I am. She unwrapped the oilcloth. Inside were 3 ledger books, their spines cracked with use, pages dense, with column entries in a small, careful hand. My father's records go back 11 years. He notes every delivery quantity, date, ranch, who signed for it. Eliza sat down across from her and opened the top ledger. The handwriting was meticulous, each entry dated and cross-referenced in the margin. She found the section covering 3 years back and began reading. The pattern emerged in about 20 minutes. It was not obvious on any single page, but when you knew what to look for. and Eliza now knew precisely what to look for. It was there. Delivery quantities to the Whitmore operation that exceeded what his registered headcount would require by a consistent margin. Not dramatic. Not the kind of number that would make a careful man stop and question it. Just enough, month over month, to indicate that whatever Whitmore was feeding, he was feeding more of it than the official records acknowledged. She turned the ledger around and pointed without speaking. Nora leaned in. Reed sat back. That's feeding maybe 40 extra head, minimum. Across 2.5 years, Eliza said. The quantities go up in spring and fall, which is when you'd expect unregistered cattle to be most visible if you were moving them. Nora was quiet. She pressed her hands flat on the table in the way Eliza had come to recognize as her version of steadying herself. That's not small. No. If Whitmore's been absorbing stolen cattle from the Rourke operation for 3 years and feeding them, and presumably selling them, that's not opportunistic. That's organized. She looked at Eliza. That means he had a source. Someone on the inside of Colton's operation who was marking the cattle, pulling them out, getting them to Whitmore, without anyone noticing. Yes, Eliza said. Do you know who? Eliza was quiet for a moment. She had been sitting with a suspicion for 2 weeks, turning it over, testing it against what she knew and what she could verify, not wanting to name it until she was close enough to certain that naming it wouldn't destroy something unfairly. She still wasn't entirely certain. But the feed ledger sitting open in front of her had just closed a gap she'd been trying to bridge. The hidden records I found in the supply room, she said carefully. The handwriting changes partway through. The earlier entries are in one hand, the later ones in another. I've been comparing that earlier hand to documents in the ranch records bills of sale, delivery signatures, work logs. Nora waited. It matches a man named Rufus Greer. He worked the Rourke Ranch for 4 years before Dex. Left abruptly 18 months ago. Eliza kept her voice level. He now works for Whitmore. The kitchen was very quiet. He took the system with him, Nora said slowly. Built it while he was at Rourke's, moved to Whitmore's operation, and kept it running from the other side. That's what the records suggest. Eliza closed the ledger. But I need one more piece. The ghost registration, the false operation the cattle are being registered under. I need to find who filed those papers, because Greer is a ranch hand. He doesn't have the legal standing or the local knowledge to file territory registration documents without help. Nora looked at her. Someone at the land office, or someone who knows how the land office works well enough to make it look legitimate. Eliza folded her hands on the table, and has enough standing that the clerk doesn't look too carefully. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, Petey was calling to someone across the yard, his voice thin in the cold morning air. The mountains behind the ranch were iron gray with cloud, the kind of sky that in this country meant the weather was organizing itself for something. I need to go back to the land office, Eliza said. But I can't go alone, and I can't go with Colton, because if Whitmore has anyone watching. I'll go with you, Nora said. My family has business at the land office regularly. Nobody will look twice at me going there. You'd be visible in this. I'm already visible. Nora's voice was flat and decided. The day I let my father's barn burn and didn't do anything about it was the worst day I've had since my mother passed. If Whitmore's behind what happened to us and he's been doing it to Colton too, she stopped. Drew a breath. I want to be visible in this. They went to the land office on Friday afternoon, arriving separately, and meeting inside with the casual ease of 2 women who happened to be running the same errand. The clerk was a young man named Purvis, who was diligent and somewhat nervous by disposition. The kind of person who finds people harder to read than documents and compensates by being extremely thorough about documents. Eliza asked to see the public registration files for the current and previous 2 years, citing general interest in understanding Valley land arrangements as a new arrival. Purvis brought the files without question. She and Nora worked through them at the counter, while Purvis returned to his desk and the quiet company of his paperwork. The ghost registration was there. Creekside Grazing Company, filed 2 years and 8 months ago, claiming a grazing range in the northeast corner of the valley near the ridgeline. Eliza had looked at that area on the maps. It was rocky, largely inaccessible, and abutted the back boundary of the Whitmore property with only a thin strip of public land between them. On paper, Creekside Grazing Company was a legitimate small operation with modest cattle numbers. In practice, cattle registered under that name could graze that strip and slip back and forth across a boundary that, on the rough terrain near the ridge, would be nearly impossible to monitor. The filing signature on the registration was a man named H. Calloway, listed as the principal operator. Eliza had not heard that name before. She wrote it down carefully, slid the paper to Nora, who read it, looked up, and kept her expression neutral with the careful effort of someone working hard at neutral. When they were outside, Nora said quietly, "Harold Calloway is Claude Whitmore's brother-in-law. He lives in Millhaven. He's never set foot on that ridge." Eliza kept walking toward the wagon. "Does he have legal standing to file in this territory? He bought a small land claim here years ago. He's technically a valley resident, even though he hasn't been here in a decade." Nora climbed up to the wagon seat. The clerk who processed that registration was the previous clerk. He retired last spring, conveniently. Purvis came in after him. He's new enough that he processes what's in front of him without knowing the history. She picked up the reins, which means the filing is technically clean. On the surface, Eliza sat beside her, but Calloway can be interviewed. His actual relationship to Whitmore is on record, and if the cattle registered under Creekside Grazing Company have Rourke brands that were altered. Brand alteration is a serious crime in this territory. "Yes," Eliza said, "it is." They drove for a while without speaking. Cold was absolute, and the sky had darkened further, pressing down on the valley with the weight of incoming weather. Eliza could feel it in the air, not just cold, but something building behind the cold. A pressure that the mountains were holding back temporarily. "We need to tell Colton," Nora said. "Tonight," Eliza said. She told him everything that evening, spread across the kitchen table, with the ledgers and the notes and the land office records, laid out in sequence, so he could follow the chain himself. She had learned by now that Colton absorbed information better when he could see it rather than just hear it. That he was a man who trusted his eyes over his ears because the frontier had taught him that words were more malleable than evidence. He went through it slowly. He asked 4 questions, all of them precise, all of them the right questions. When he finished, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head that he doesn't want to finish. "Greer," he said, "I trusted that man. You hired him in good faith. He was in Whitmore's arrangement before he ever came to you, or he entered it soon after." She paused. His leaving when he did suggests he'd either been caught near the edge of being found out, or the operation had developed enough that they didn't need him inside anymore. "The hidden records stop about 2 years ago," Colton said, "around when he left, because by then the Creekside grazing registration was in place. They had a legal framework for the cattle. They didn't need to hide the details inside your records anymore. They just needed to keep the supply coming. But the supply stopped when Greer left, or slowed. We know the diversion was happening during Greer's time. What we don't know is whether someone else stepped into that role after him." She kept her voice even. "Someone who's still here." Colton went very still. She watched him work through it, the people currently on his operation, the access each of them had, the periods when things had seemed off. She had her own candidate for this, but she needed him to arrive at it himself, because an accusation from her would land differently than a conclusion he reached through his own evidence. He said, "The feed quantities." She waited. "Dex orders the feed. He's the one who tallies what we use and what we need." He looked at the Hess ledger, open to the page she had marked. "These quantities that are running high, when did they start?" "They increased about 4 months after Greer left," she said carefully. "And they've maintained at this level since." Colton put his hands on the table and looked at them. She could see him fighting it 6 years, of working beside a man, of depending on him, of building the kind of trust that comes from shared hard seasons. That was not nothing. That was real, and watching him have to dismantle, it was not pleasant. "I don't want it to be Dex," he said finally, "I know. But wanting doesn't change what the numbers say." "No," she said, "it doesn't." He was quiet for a long time. "I can't accuse him without proof I can put in front of a judge. If I'm wrong, we're not accusing him yet. We're watching." She leaned forward slightly. "And we need to be careful how we watch. Because if he's in contact with Whitmore and he notices we're watching, we lose the chance to catch anything that ties this together." Colton nodded slowly. He picked up the land office note she'd made, the one with Calloway's name on it. "Read it again. Whitmore's been here 15 years. He's on 2 county boards. His lawyer is based in Denver." He set the paper down. "Taking this to the sheriff with what we have now is not enough," she agreed. "Not yet. We need the branded cattle. If we can find Rourke brands on cattle registered to Creekside Grazing, that's evidence a judge can act on. She met his eyes, which means someone needs to go up to that ridge. He looked at her. I'll go, not alone and not obviously. She paused. And not yet. We need a few more days. Nora's father is going back through his older records. If we can find when the quantities first shifted, we can build a complete timeline that accounts for every stage of this. He held her gaze. She could see him measuring the situation the way he measured everything practically, without illusions. Accounting for risk, rather than pretending it wasn't there. You've been running this investigation for 2 weeks, he said, while managing the house, fixing the accounts, handling whatever the Valley women have been throwing at you. There was no particular admiration in his voice, just the noting of a fact. That's a lot to carry. It needed carrying, she said. Still, he picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. I could have helped with more of it. She was fairly certain, the closest thing to an apology that Colton Rourke did on a routine basis. She accepted it in the spirit it was given. You can help by acting normal around Dex, she said. For the next few days, nothing changes. Same work, same conversations, same everything. I've been faking fine for 4 years, he said. I can manage a few days. Storm arrived on a Saturday, which nobody expected because the weather had been building in a direction that suggested it would hold through the weekend. The sky had been wrong for 3 days, a particular shade of flat gray that old-timers in the valley called the lid, meaning the atmosphere was sealed and pressure was collecting underneath it. Eliza had noticed it and filed it away. She had not anticipated how fast it would collapse. She woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of the wind-changing register, not the ordinary winter wind, which had a steady push to it, but something with variable force, gusting and dropping and gusting again in a pattern that meant a true storm front, rather than just cold air moving through. She lay in the dark listening to it for about 30 seconds, calculating, then got up. By the time she had her boots on and her coat, Colton was already in the main room pulling on his gear. He looked at her without surprise. It's coming fast, he said. The cattle on the north pasture. Already thinking about it. He was buttoning his coat, moving with the efficiency of a man who has done this before under pressure. If the creek floods, the low section near the east fence will go first. That's where the youngest stock is. She was already moving toward the door. I'll get Petey. Dex will be in the bunkhouse. He'll wake up when. I'll get Petey, she said again. Not arguing, just redirecting. She needed Dex occupied with the near pasture work, not the north fence, not tonight when they couldn't watch him. Colton caught what she meant, nodded once. Outside the wind was brutal, the kind of cold that had teeth in it, coming off the mountains with the particular violence of a front that has been held back too long and has finally breached whatever was containing it. She bent into it and crossed the yard to the bunkhouse, hammering on the door until Petey opened it, half asleep and bewildered. North pasture now, she said. Get dressed. What? Storm. The young stock is in the low section. Move. He moved. She went back to the barn where Colton was already saddling horses, his hands working fast and sure in the dark. She took the second horse without being asked and had it ready. In half the time, Petey needed to get his coat on. Dex appeared in the barn doorway moments later, reading the situation with the quick competence of an experienced hand. I'll take the south fence, Dex said. Wind's coming from the northeast. South fence is going to take pressure. Go, Colton said. They split. Colton took the north pasture main route. Eliza and Petey took the creek path, faster but rougher in the dark, the ground under them already uncertain from the first wave of rain that had come through in the early morning hours and softened the soil before the real storm built. The creek was running higher than it should have been for this time of night. Eliza felt it before she saw it, the sound of it, the particular urgency in moving water that is reaching its banks. She pulled up at the east fence line and dismounted in one motion, handing her reins to Petey and going to the fence on foot because the ground was already unreliable, and she wasn't going to put the horse on it. The young stock, 23 head of yearlings and 2-year-olds, had pushed themselves to the high corner of the pen, which was instinct, and it was right. But the fence on the north side of that corner was older than the rest, and she could see in the darkness that 2 of the posts had shifted from the water, softening the ground beneath them. She went to the fence and put her weight against it. It moved more than it should, Petey. She kept her voice even. get the post driver from the wagon, and the spare wire from the saddlebag left side. In this Petey, she held the fence post with both hands, the wire biting into her palms through her gloves. Now he went. He was a young man who, when given a clear direction, stopped second-guessing and moved. She had noticed that about him early and had been careful to give him clear directions. She held the post while the wind came in 3 heavy gusts that made her stagger sideways without letting go. The cattle in the corner were pressing against each other, the whites of their eyes visible, the particular low distressed sound they made when they were frightened and keeping it inside. She talked to them, not words exactly, just a steady low sound, the kind her mother had made over sick children, and that turned out to work on cattle too, keeping them just calm enough not to bolt. Petey came back with the driver and the wire. He was not a large young man, but he was wiry and stronger than he looked, and he took the post from her hands and drove it back into the ground with efficient force while she ran the wire. They worked without much talking, which was the right way to do it. The storm didn't care about your commentary, and neither did the fence. When it was secured, she moved along the fence line to check the next section, then the next. 2 more posts needed resetting. She and Petey reset them. By the time they finished, her hands were shaking inside the gloves, and not from cold. She found Colton at the north corner of the pasture, where he had managed to redirect 3 cattle that had pushed through a section of fence that the previous storm 2 seasons ago had weakened, and nobody had gotten to properly since. He had them blocked with his horse and was pushing them back through the gap, and she came around the fence on foot and helped him work them through without spooking the others. When the cattle were back in and the gap temporarily blocked with boards from the fence wagon, he looked at her across the backs of the cattle. Both of them were soaked. The wind was still driving hard. "Creek," he said. "High but not over yet. The east fence is holding. I reset 4 posts. In this dark, Petey helped. He looked at the posts from where he stood. You could have been hurt. So could the cattle." She pulled her coat tighter. "How's the main herd?" "Spooked but contained. The north fence is solid." He scanned the pasture, reading it the way he read everything, systematically. "We should check the water trough heating system. If it freezes in the pipes tonight, I'll check it. You take the south end and see what Dex has on the fence situation there." He looked at her for a moment in the rain and the dark, with the wind throwing everything sideways and the cattle moving restlessly and the creak audible above all of it. Then he said, "All right." She went to the trough system. The heating mechanism was a simple arrangement of banked coals in a covered channel running beneath the main trough, designed to keep the water from freezing in hard weather. Someone she suspected, Dex, in this case acting in good faith, had let the coal level run low over the past week. She found what was left in the supply shed and rebuilt the bank. Not enough to fully solve the problem, but enough to hold through the night. She was on her knees in the supply shed with coal dust on her hands, and her hair completely destroyed by the wind when she heard footsteps outside and Dex appeared in the doorway. He stopped when he saw her. She looked up at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "South fence," she said, holding. "Lost 1 post at the corner. Reset it." He was looking at her hands, at the coal, at the trough system she had rebuilt. Reading it the way she had learned to read the account books, not just what was there, but what it meant. "You knew the heating was low. I noticed it 2 days ago. I should have mentioned it sooner." She stood up, brushing her hands on her coat ineffectively. "My fault for not bringing it up." He was quiet. He had the expression of a man who has been holding a position for a long time and is beginning to feel the effort of it. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "Nobody ever is," she said. "Usually." He didn't say anything else. He turned and went back out into the storm. She watched him go and felt the complicated weight of knowing what she knew about him, not certain yet, not proven, but close, and having to carry it like another piece of the fence, just holding it in place until the moment to act on it arrived. The storm peaked around 5 in the morning and began easing by 7. In the cold gray light of the aftermath they took stock. 17 fence posts that needed permanent resetting, 2 sections of fence that needed complete replacement, 1 outbuilding with a portion of roof lifted and caved in over the storage end, no cattle lost, no horses injured, no people hurt beyond the ordinary damage of a hard night in bad weather. Colton stood in the yard, looking at the damage list that Eliza had already made by the time he came in from the final pasture check. She had made it sitting at the kitchen table with coffee she didn't fully taste, running the numbers, calculating material costs and labor time and priority order. He read it. You slept? A little. She hadn't, but an hour of lying down counted for something. The outbuilding roof is the immediate priority before another weather event. The fence sections, I've marked them in order. The east section's first, because the creek running high is going to keep that ground soft, and we'll lose more posts if we wait. He sat down across from her. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who has run past, tired into a second, harder version of it, where your body has stopped complaining because it's too exhausted to bother. She suspected she looked the same. Petey told me about the east fence, he said. About you holding the post in the wind. She waited. He said you talked to the cattle. It works, she said. Calm down. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the damage list. You were right about the drainage on the west wall. Last night made it worse. I could see the water coming in at the base when the creek surge pushed water back through the ground. I know, I added it to the list. She pointed to it. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment in the particular way that meant he was working up to saying something he wasn't entirely sure how to say. She had learned to recognize the quality of his silences as well as his speech by now, which was its own kind of thing, learning a person's silences. Patterson came out during the storm, he said. Rode over to see if we needed hands. She looked up. Patterson did. Spent 2 hours helping with the main herd before he went back to check on his own operation. Colton looked at the table. He didn't have to do that. No, she said. He didn't. He said Colton stopped. Organized it. He said that whatever was coming in this valley, he wanted it on record that he had no part in it and no knowledge of it, but that he'd been watching something he should have spoken up about sooner, and he wasn't going to be quiet about it anymore. Eliza set down her coffee cup very carefully. He said that. He said, I should talk to you about it. Colton met her eyes. Tells me he knew you were already working on it. He may have had more information than he let on at the gathering, she said. He told me I was asking the right questions, but to be careful about the order. I think he was trying to protect himself until he figured out which way this was going to land. And now? Now the storm happened, and he rode over here at 3 a.m. to help with the herd. She paused. People do things in storms that they don't do in ordinary weather. The performance falls away. You find out what a person actually is. Colton looked at her for a moment. Is that what you were doing last night? Finding out what people actually are? I was fixing fence posts, she said, but yes, also that. Sheriff Arden came to the ranch 2 days after the storm, which was not entirely a surprise, because storms in a valley had a way of revealing damage that had been hidden under ordinary conditions, and this one was no exception in more ways than the obvious ones. He was a lean man of about 40, with a methodical way of moving and the particular neutrality of someone who has learned not to show their hand in company they're still assessing. Eliza had formed no fixed opinion of him, which was itself an opinion. She could read most people fairly quickly, and the ones she couldn't read were either very good at concealment or very careful by training, and Arden struck her as the latter. He came ostensibly about storm damage reports, which all the valley operations were filing for county purposes. He sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee and talked to Colton about fence lines and water damage with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had many stops to make and was in no particular rush at any of them. Then he said, in exactly the same tone, I've been looking at the Creekside Grazing Company registration. Kitchen was quiet enough that Eliza could hear the ranch sounds from outside with unusual clarity. Is that right? Colton said. Something about it has been bothering me since I came into this district. Arden held his coffee cup without drinking from it. The range claim is on terrain that's essentially unworkable for grazing. Rocks and ridge. You'd lose cattle up there faster than you could profit from them. He paused. Unless you were using the range claim for a different purpose than grazing. Colton looked at Eliza. She kept her expression neutral and gave him the slightest nod. What kind of purpose? Colton said. As a staging area, Arden said, for cattle moving between one branded identity and another. He finally drank from his coffee. Brand alteration is a serious matter. Takes time and some skill. You need a place where you can keep cattle out of sight long enough to do the work and let the marks heal to the point where they're not obviously fresh. He set the cup down. That ridge, backing up to the Whitmore property boundary, would give you about 3 days of natural cover from the main valley lines. Eliza set her own cup down slowly. You've been investigating this. Arden looked at her. I've been watching it. Investigating requires evidence. He paused. I understand. You've been looking at some records. She didn't ask how he knew. It didn't matter. I've been organizing the ranch accounts, she said carefully. I found some irregularities. He was studying her with that neutral assessment she couldn't get behind. Miss Vane, I'm going to tell you something that I'd normally not share with civilians, because it interferes with an ongoing inquiry. I'm going to tell you because I think you've already largely figured it out, and I'd rather you work with me than around me. She waited. I have a witness in Millhaven who saw cattle carrying an altered Rourke brand being sold through a private arrangement to a buyer from outside the territory. This was 8 months ago. The buyer didn't know the brands were altered. He just knew he was getting a good price on good stock. He looked between them. The seller was an intermediary who I've since connected to Harold Calloway. Colton made a sound that was not quite a word. What I don't have, Arden continued, is evidence that ties the operation on this end to the Millhaven sale in a way that will stand up to a competent lawyer, which Whitmore has, in Denver. He paused, and I don't have the person inside this valley who has been selecting and moving the cattle to the ridge. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. If I could give you corroborating evidence on the feed quantities specifically, quantities that exceed registered head count by a consistent margin over 2 years, would that help build the chain? Arden looked at her with an expression that for the first time had something unambiguous in it. It would help considerably. I have the records, she said. From the Hess feed operation. Colton said, there's something else. He looked at Eliza again, the question in it, and she nodded. He turned back to Arden. We have reason to believe the operation here on this end involves a current employee of this ranch. Arden set his cup down and gave Colton his full attention. His name is Dex Harlan, Colton said. His voice was steady and it cost him something. He's been with me 6 years. I want to be wrong about this. Tell me why you think it's him, Arden said. Eliza laid it out. She took him through the feed quantity timeline, the point where it elevated after Greer left. The access Dex had to the ordering records. The periods of absence she had noted in the work logs that corresponded to delivery dates on the Ridge Road. She laid it out methodically and without dramatic emphasis. The way she had organized the accounts clear, cross-referenced, one thing leading to the next. When she finished, Arden was quiet for a moment. That's a careful piece of work, he said. There are gaps, she said. I know there are gaps. There are always gaps. He stood up, reaching for his hat. I'm going to need a few more days. And I'm going to need both of you to continue acting normally, which I understand is a significant ask. He looked at Colton, particularly for you. I managed 4 years of things I didn't show, Colton said. I can manage a few days. Arden put his hat on. One more thing. He paused at the door. Whitmore has a meeting scheduled in town on Friday with the county land commissioner. He files paperwork at those meetings. If he's expecting to move another batch of cattle before the heavy winter weather closes the Ridge Road, he'd want the documentation in place first. He looked between them. Friday gives us a window. If we can catch the movement, I'll go up to the ridge, Colton said. Not you. Arden shook his head. He knows your horse, your face, your habits. He's been watching this operation for 3 years. He knows your patterns better than you think. He looked at Eliza. He doesn't know yours. The kitchen was quiet. She's not going up to a ridge in winter to surveil a cattle theft operation, Colton said. His voice was flat. I can speak for myself, Eliza said. She looked at Arden. What would I be looking for? Movement. Cattle count. Any altered brands you can see clearly enough to describe. He paused. And ideally, a witness account of who brings them up. Eliza. Colton's voice had something in it she had not heard before, not anger exactly, not command exactly. Something tighter than either. This is not organizing account books. She turned to look at him. I know that. If Whitmore finds out, then I'll need to be careful not to be found. She held his gaze. You said yourself you can manage a few days of things you don't show. So can I. He looked at her for a long moment. The same look as the night on the wagon, coming home from the gathering, the look of a man updating his understanding of a situation he thought he had mapped. Except this time it had fear underneath it. The specific fear of someone who has started to care about an outcome in a way that makes the stakes feel different. She noticed this. She was not sure what to do with it yet. 2 conditions, he said finally. She waited. You don't go alone. And you come back before dark. She looked at Arden. Arden looked at Colton. Then he said, I can have a deputy positioned on the south side of the ridge. She'd be between two sets of eyes. Colton was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. One motion, tight and decided. Friday, Eliza said. Friday, Arden says. He left. The door closed behind him, and the kitchen was quiet again, with the particular quality of a room in which something has just been agreed to that cannot be undone. Eliza stood at the table, looking at her notes, feeling the particular clarifying sensation of a situation that has been building toward a point and has now reached it. Colton was standing near the window. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, without turning, be careful. She looked at his back, at the set of his shoulders, which she had learned to read as precisely as his silences. Always, she said. It was not entirely true, but it was what she could offer him right now, and he accepted it without turning around, because they were both people who knew the difference between what was true and what was necessary, and had learned to live in that gap without pretending it didn't exist. Thursday passed the way the day before. A hard thing always passes too slowly in the hours, and too fast in the moments when you forgot to watch it. Eliza spent the morning on the fence repair, working alongside Petey on the east section where the creek had done the most damage. She worked with her hands, because her hands knew what to do without her having to think about it, and thinking was something she needed to ration carefully right now. There was a particular discipline to not running through the next day too many times in your head. At some point, the rehearsal stopped being useful, and became its own kind of fear. Petey didn't talk much, which she appreciated. He had developed, over the weeks she had been at the ranch, a kind of easy working rhythm with her that didn't require conversation to sustain it. He handed her things before she asked for them. He read the work the way she read it. He was 19 years old and had more instinctive competence than he had any idea of yet, which was both a good thing and something that would probably cost him at some point before he figured out how to use it properly. Around mid-morning, without looking up from the wire he was stretching, he said, Dex has been different this week. She kept her hands moving. Different how? Quieter. He's always quiet, but this is another kind. He paused. Like when something's wrong with one of the horses, and they go still in a way they don't usually go still. You know something's changed, but you don't know what. She considered how to answer this. The honest answer was not available. Storms affect people differently, she said. Some people need a few days to settle after something hard. Petey looked at her sidelong. He was not unintelligent. She could see him deciding whether to push the question further or leave it. He left it, which was the right call, and they went back to the fence. She found herself thinking about Cal. Her brother, somewhere in Nevada or not in Nevada, alive or not alive, at some distance that had stopped being measurable in miles and started being measurable in silence. She thought about him sometimes. When she was doing physical work, it was the only time the thinking didn't have an edge to it, when her hands were occupied. He had been funny in the way that people from hard circumstances sometimes are, finding the absurdity in things rather than the tragedy, because the tragedy was available to anyone, and the absurdity took more work. She had inherited the same tendency from the same circumstances, and mostly kept it to herself, because people who didn't know her well read it as callousness. She wondered if he would have liked Colton. She thought, probably yes, eventually, after the initial period where they would have circled each other like two dogs at a fence, both of them too self-contained for easy company. She missed him with a sharp and useless specificity. After lunch, she went back to the account books and did the final organization of the evidence packet she had been building, the Rourke hidden records, the Hess feed ledger copies Nora had allowed her to make, the land office notes, the timeline she had constructed linking each piece to the next. She organized it the way she organized everything, so that someone coming to it cold could follow the chain without her there to explain it. She made 2 copies of the summary and put one in the account book drawer and one in her coat pocket. Colton came in from the afternoon work and found her at the table with the papers. He didn't ask what she was doing. He went to the stove and poured himself coffee and stood there drinking it, looking at the wall, and she let him have the silence because she understood it. After a while, he said, Patterson's going to be at the Ridge Road turnoff tomorrow morning. She looked up. You spoke to him. He came by this afternoon while you were on the fence. He set the cup down. He wants to ride the ridge from the north side. He says he knows terrain up there that Arden's deputy doesn't, from a hunting trip years ago. He paused. He has his own reasons for wanting Whitmore caught. I think the barn fire might not be the only thing Patterson's been sitting on. Did he say that? He said that Whitmore tried to acquire the South water rights from his operation 2 years ago through a method that wasn't exactly a legal offer. He turned to look at her. He wouldn't be more specific, but he was angry in the way men get when they've been swallowing something for a long time. Eliza looked at the papers in front of her. The shape of the thing had been widening for weeks, and she had kept adjusting her sense of its size, and it kept being larger than the last adjustment. Whitmore's been doing this across multiple operations, she said. Not just ours. The cattle theft, the water rights pressure, the barn fire. He's been building position in this valley systematically. And nobody stopped him, because nobody had the full picture, Colton said. Everybody had a piece, and nobody talked to anybody else. Until now. He looked at her. The late afternoon light came through the window and did what light does in October, made everything look both warmer and more finite than it was. Until you started asking questions, and people started answering them. She didn't respond to that directly. Tomorrow. Are you going to be able to hold decks here? I've got work that needs 2 people on the south pasture. It'll take all morning. His voice was still steady, but she could hear the effort under it. If he's planning to move cattle tomorrow, it'll be in the morning, before Whitmore's meeting in town. Whitmore needs to be seen in town by the land commissioner, so the movement has to happen before he leaves. He paused. Dex would need to get away from the south pasture work by 7. And if he does, I'll give him an excuse and watch which direction he goes. He said it plainly, without drama, the way a person states a hard thing they've already made peace with. He's been lying to me for a long time. I can watch him go and know what it means. She looked at him across the table. He was not a man who showed damage easily, but she had learned his tells by now, the particular set of his jaw, when something was costing him more than he was going to say, the way his hands on a flat surface pressed down slightly more than necessary. He was pressing down now. I'm sorry, she said. He looked at her. For what? For the fact that someone you trusted for 6 years wasn't who you thought. She held his gaze. That's a real loss, even if it's necessary to see it clearly. He was quiet for a moment. You've had a few of those. People not being who you thought. A few, she said. You don't seem broken by it. I don't seem it, she agreed. That's not the same as not being it. He looked at her for a moment with the expression that she had come to understand was his version of careful attention. Not soft, not warm exactly, but entirely present. Then he picked up his coffee cup and went back to looking at the wall, which was how he closed a conversation that had gone somewhere real, and she turned back to her papers, which was how she did the same thing. Friday morning arrived, with a cold so clean it hurt to breathe it. The sky was clear in the way it gets after a storm has exhausted itself, a hard bright blue that promised nothing comforting. Eliza was on her horse and moving before full light, taking the east road, and then the cutoff that ran along the creek toward the base of the ridge. Arden's deputy, a young man named Caswell, who had the cautious professional air of someone who takes his instructions very seriously, was already at the meeting point, mounted and waiting in the shadow of a stand of bare cottonwood. Sheriff says you know what you're looking for, he said. Cattle with altered brands. Count, direction of movement, who's driving them. She checked her gloves, her coat, the field glass she had borrowed from Colson's supply room. And who brings them to the ridge? If it's who you think. Then Sheriff Arden will have what he needs to hold him for questioning when he meets him at the south fence line. She looked at the ridge above them. The road that led up was barely a road, more of a wagon track that had been used enough to establish itself without ever being officially constructed. How far up? The flat area where the Creekside Range claim puts the cattle is about 40 minutes on horseback. There's a rock outcrop on the east side that gives you a view of the flat without being on it. You'll be on the west approach? 15 minutes behind you. I won't come up until you signal. He paused. Do not approach the cattle or anyone with them directly. You observe, you record, you signal. That's all I understand, she said. She went up. The ridge road was worse than she had anticipated and better than she had feared, which was a pattern she had noticed about difficult things. They were rarely exactly what your imagination built. The horse was sure-footed, a bay gelding named Anchor that Colton had chosen for her from the string with no comment, and she had come to trust Anchor's judgment on uncertain ground more than her own, which was the correct hierarchy when you were on terrain you didn't know. She reached the outcrop Caswell had described in 35 minutes. She dismounted, tied anchor to a scrub pine that was sheltered from the open flat, and went the rest of the way on foot. From the outcrop, she could see the flat, about 4 acres of ground, that was marginally less rocky than the surrounding ridge, bounded on the west by a natural rise and on the east by a drop that concealed it from the valley below. It was a good hiding place, not perfect, but good enough that casual observation from the valley floor would find nothing, and the approach road was steep enough to discourage casual visitors. There were cattle on the flat. She counted quickly, using the field glass, going systematically left to right. 31 head, mixed age, most of them 2- and 3-year-olds. They were calm enough they'd been here a few days at least, long enough to settle. She swept the glass along their flanks, looking for brands. The brands were there and they were wrong. She knew Colton's brand, the double R that his family had used for 30 years, burned into the left hip. What she saw on these cattle was a bar R, the double R, with the left arm of the first R extended into a connecting line. It was not a crude alteration. Whoever had done it knew their work, had let the mark heal for weeks, had chosen young stock with enough muscle and fat to absorb the new burn without visible trauma. But the base of the old brand was there if you knew to look for it, a slightly different texture and color density in the healed tissue. Counted the bar R brand she could clearly identify. 17. The other 14 either had their left flanks turned away or were positioned such that she couldn't get a clear enough angle. She was noting the count in the small book she had brought when she heard the horse below. Not Caswell, he was coming up the west approach, and she knew his horse's sound by now. This was from the direction of the Ridge Road, the east route, which was the Whitmore property boundary approach. She went flat against the rock and looked. Dex came up the road at a steady pace, riding the gray horse she had seen him on 100 times, leading a second horse with 2 large saddlebags. Behind him, on foot and moving fast despite the grade, was a man she had not seen before heavyset, wearing a coat that was too light for the weather, moving with the purposeful discomfort of someone who is used to doing this and has never learned to dress for it. Rufus Greer. She had not seen him, only the record of him, but the way he moved with Dex, the wordless coordination of 2 people who have done a thing together many times, told her everything she needed to confirm. Dex dismounted at the edge of the flat. He didn't look around with the caution of someone who feared being watched. He had done this enough times that caution had worn into habit, become invisible within his ordinary movement. He tied his horse to a post that had been sunk into the ground specifically for this purpose. She could see the wear on the rope marks from previous visits and began moving through the cattle with professional efficiency of a man doing his job. Greer opened the saddlebags. Inside were branding irons and a portable fire kit. They were going to do the final alteration work on the remaining cattle, the ones whose brands hadn't been finished. Her hand was shaking when she wrote it down. Not from fear, or not only fear. From the cold and from the particular physical reaction she had never entirely been able to control when something she had suspected for weeks was standing in front of her in plain reality. She documented everything she could see. She wrote fast and precisely, the way she kept accounts. When she had enough, she took out the small square of red cloth she had agreed with. Caswell would be the signal, and she held it out past the edge of the rock and counted to 5 and pulled it back. Then she waited. What happened next did not go as planned, which was itself not a surprise, because things that go as planned on a frontier ridge in October, when you are surveilling a cattle theft operation, are things that happen in simpler stories than this one. Caswell came up the west approach as agreed. But Greer, moving through the cattle, caught the sound of the horse before Caswell had fully positioned himself, and Greer was a man whose survival instincts had been sharpened by years of close operation. He said something to Dex that she couldn't hear from the outcrop, and Dex's head came up, and both of them went still in the particular way of men who are calculating distances and options. Then Dex turned and looked directly at the outcrop. She couldn't tell whether he saw her. The rock face was substantial, and she was well back from the edge. But he was looking at it with an attention that was too specific to be casual, and she felt the space between them as a physical thing, 40 yards of open ground, and a full understanding of what it would mean if he crossed it. He didn't cross it. He turned to Greer and said something else, and Greer dropped the branding iron and moved towards horse with the fast economy of a man who has an exit route he has thought about in advance. Sheriff's office. Caswell's voice came from the west edge of the flat. Nobody move. Greer moved. He was back on his horse before Caswell had finished the sentence, pushing through the cattle toward the east road. The cattle responded to his urgency and broke in multiple directions, and for 30 seconds, the flat was a confusion of moving animals and two men yelling and the specific chaos of a situation coming apart faster than anyone had scripted it. Dex didn't run. This was the thing she had not expected. She had built a version of this moment in her head in which Dex made the same calculation as Greer and took the same exit, and instead he stood at the edge of the flat with his hands at his sides and watched Greer go and did not follow. Caswell had his hands full with a horse that didn't like the cattle moving at it and couldn't pursue Greer without abandoning Dex. He made the right choice and held on Dex, and Dex let him, standing there with an expression that Eliza could see from the outcrop and couldn't entirely parse. She came down from the rock. She walked across the flat, skirting the unsettled cattle, until she was standing 10 feet from Dex. Caswell was between them and to the left. His horse finally steadied. Dex looked at her. His face was doing something complicated that she had no clean word for, not guilt exactly, not defiance. Something more like a man who has been carrying a thing for so long that having it taken away is both relief and devastation. Greer will run for the territory line, he said. Not to her specifically. Just saying it. We have a man on the North Ridge approach, Caswell said. Patterson's riding the north side. Dex absorbed this. Nodded once, slowly. How long have you known? Eliza answered, because Caswell hadn't been there for the knowing. Long enough, he looked at her. Did Colton he knows? She said. Something in his face changed when she said that. She had thought the hardest thing for Dex in this moment would be the getting caught. She saw now it was the other thing, the knowledge that Colton knew. 6 years was a real thing. It didn't dissolve because you had betrayed it. It started before I came to the Rourke operation, he said. It was not a justification. It sounded more like a man trying to place himself accurately in a story that was larger than him. Greer brought me in. Said it was already running, said my job was just to maintain the supply line after he moved across. Said nobody would ever look. He paused. First time I did it, I told myself it was the last time. It never is, Eliza said. No. He looked at the cattle settling around them, the branded flanks, the evidence of what 3 years looked like when you could walk through it. It never is. Caswell rode up beside Dex and indicated he should mount up, which Dex did without resistance. As Caswell began walking him back toward the road, Dex turned once more to look at Eliza. For what it's worth, he said, you're a better hand than I let myself admit. She held his gaze. I know, she said. It came out harder than she intended. She let it stand. By noon, the news had moved through Blackstone Valley with the particular velocity of information that people have been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. Patterson's presence on the North Ridge had turned Greer back before he reached the territory line, and Caswell had him and Dex both in custody and moving toward town before the morning was fully established. Arden arrested Whitmore at his meeting with the land commissioner, which was a choice that was partly strategic and partly, Eliza suspected, the satisfaction of catching a man in the specific place where he had been most thoroughly comfortable among official paperwork. Inside the legal apparatus he had been manipulating for 3 years. Whitmore's composure held for approximately 4 minutes before it didn't, which was longer than some people managed, and shorter than he probably thought he would. The land commissioner, a territory official from Denver, who had no connection to Whitmore beyond the regular business of his office, was startled and then deeply unhappy, which suggested to Eliza that he was genuinely lean and not part of the arrangement. Arden confirmed this later. The commissioner's involvement had been entirely procedural. Whitmore's corruption contained enough to use the official channels without contaminating the people inside them. Harold Calloway, the brother-in-law in Millhaven, with the Creekside grazing registration, hired a lawyer by the following morning and began negotiating with the territorial prosecutor before the week was out. He was the weakest point in the arrangement, and he knew it. And the speed of his cooperation suggested he had always known that if the thing collapsed, he would be the first to deal. Eliza heard all of this in pieces over 2 days, assembled from what Arden told Colton directly, what Nora reported from town, and what Patterson relayed through his own channels. She assembled the pieces the same way she assembled everything methodically, fitting them into the existing structure, adjusting where the structure needed adjustment. She was at the kitchen table doing this on Saturday afternoon when Colton came in from a long ride that she had not asked him about, and he had not explained. He came in and sat down across from her and looked at his hands for a moment. "I went to see Dex," he said. She set her pen down. "He's in the county holding until the territorial marshal takes custody next week." He looked up. "He knew I was coming," one of Arden's men told him. I paused. "He didn't say much. I didn't say much. We sat across from each other for about 10 minutes, and then I got up and left." She waited. "I don't know what I expected from that," he said. "I don't know what I was looking for. Probably the same thing anyone looks for when they go see someone who betrayed them," she said. "Something that makes it make sense. An explanation that accounts for the gap between who you thought they were and who they actually were." "Did you find it?" "When you talked to him on the ridge. He told me it started before he came to you. That Greer recruited him before he ever took the Rourke job." She paused. "I don't know if that's entirely true. I know it's not entirely false." Colton was quiet. "He was good at the work," he said finally. "Whatever else was true. He was a genuinely good ranch hand. People are usually more than one thing," she said. "Doesn't excuse the rest. But it's true." He looked at her. "You're not angry at him." "I'm angry at what he did," she said. "That's different from being angry at him." She picked up her pen again. Anger at specific actions is useful. Anger at a whole person tends to spread out and lose its point. He watched her for a moment. She was aware of being watched the way you're aware of whether something's register and account for, without making the primary concern. Then he said, "Patterson wants to talk to us. Both of us. He says he has a proposal." She looked up. "What kind of proposal?" "He wouldn't say. Just that he'd come by Monday and he'd like us both present." He paused. He used the word us. She noted this without comment. The word had weight, and she could see Colton knew it. They were not yet. She did not have a clean word for what they were yet, which was itself significant because she was generally precise about language. What they had built over the past weeks was real and functional, and still in the process of becoming something nameable. "Monday, then," she said. Sunday came and went quietly, which after the previous week felt almost suspicious. Eliza spent the morning going back through the account books. Now that the investigation pieces had been handed to Arden, doing the final clean version of the Rourke financial records with the theft losses properly documented and the forward projections recalculated without the drain of 3 years of systematic diversion. The numbers cleaned up were better than Colton had thought. He had been operating under the assumption that the ranch was performing at a modest level, income steady but not growing. What the cleaned account showed was that the diversion had been masking what was actually a stronger operation. Take away the cattle being bled off, add back the money going to the Millhaven supplier at the inflated rate she had caught in the first week, and the Rourke Ranch had been performing significantly above what the raw ledgers suggested. She presented this to him Sunday evening with the same manner she used for all account presentations. "Here are the numbers. Here is what they mean. Here is what they suggest for next season." He listened, asked 2 precise questions, and then was quiet for long enough that she looked up from the ledger. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized as the updated assessment look, except that by now it had been updated enough times that it no longer looked like surprise. It looked like something else. "What?" she said. "I'm trying to figure out how to say something," he said. She waited. She was genuinely curious, because Colton not knowing how to say something was uncommon. He was usually more efficient at speech than people gave him credit for. "When I wrote that letter," he said, "when I put the advertisement out, I was looking for function. I told you that. I was not looking for," he stopped, "organized. I was not expecting to find someone who would change how I think about what this place is." She looked at him. "What do you mean, what this place is?" "The ranch. I've been running it like a holding action since Margaret died. Like the point was just to keep it going, keep the cattle numbers up, keep the operation viable." He looked at the account books. "You came in 3 weeks ago, and inside that time you've exposed a 3-year theft, reorganized the finances, identified a drainage problem I've been ignoring, started a kitchen garden, made an ally of the Hess family, and apparently also fixed enough fence posts in a storm to impress a 19-year-old who is not easily impressed." He looked back at her. "That's not function. That's something else." She looked at him steadily. "It's just work." "It's not just work," he said, "and you know it's not." She was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them was the same lamp they had sat by the first night she showed him the hidden records, and the light it made was the same uneven, warm light. And some things between then and now had changed so incrementally that she had not tracked the accumulation. But sitting here now, she could feel the weight of it, the weeks of working beside this man, of learning his silences, of watching him hold things with a self-containment that she recognized because she operated the same way, of the specific and unperformed moment on the wagon when he had offered her his hand. "No," she said, "it's not just work." He nodded once as though she had confirmed something he had already calculated and just needed the external verification of. "I'd like to make this permanent," he said. "If you're willing." She looked at him. "We already agreed to marry." "I know." He was, she realized, mildly uncomfortable, which was so rare for him that it had a kind of clarifying effect. "I'd like it to be a real marriage, not just a functional arrangement." He looked at the table, then back at her. "I understand that's a different thing from what we agreed to, and I understand if you need time to think about whether it's something you want." She sat with that for a moment. The lamp moved slightly in a draft she couldn't locate. "I'm not a person who has a lot of ease in me," she said. I can be hard to be around. I get into things and I don't come out until they're finished. I'm not warm in the way that Eliza." His voice was patient. "I've been watching you for 3 weeks. I know what you are." She looked at him. "And I'm asking anyway." She held his gaze for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved across the pasture with the ordinary quiet of a Sunday night in October. Cattle were settled. The mountains were where they always were. The lamp burned the same way it always burned. "Yes," she said. "All right." He nodded again. She had come to understand that, with Colton Rourke, a nod that was single and deliberate was the equivalent of something much longer from someone else. It carried weight, precisely because it didn't try to perform it. Patterson arrived Monday morning with the directness of a man who has made a decision and has no interest in circling it. He accepted coffee and sat down and said, "I'll be honest with you both because I think you've earned it, and I don't have time for anything else." Colton, across the table, said, "Go ahead." 3 years ago, before the Creekside business started, Whitmore came to me about a water rights consolidation. He wanted the 3 major operations, his, mine, and yours, to pool the water rights claims under a single managing entity which he would control. He set his coffee cup down. I told him no. 2 months later, my south fence was cut 3 times in 6 weeks. Cattle walked, not many but enough. He looked at Eliza. I never connected it to Whitmore directly at the time. Now I think I should have. He was establishing what the cost of no was, Eliza said. Yes. He didn't come at me directly after that, but the fence incident stopped when I stopped challenging his land office filings on the eastern boundary. His jaw was tight. I told myself it was a coincidence. I knew it wasn't. What's the proposal? Colton said. The Creekside grazing registration is going to be dissolved as part of the investigation. That leaves the Northeast Ridge Range officially unclaimed. He paused. I want to put in a joint claim, Rourke and Patterson. The range is usable for summer grazing if you put in 1 water point near the upper flat. Split the cost, split the access, file it together so neither operation is managing it alone. Eliza looked at the range map she had pulled out while Patterson was talking. The Northeast Ridge territory was larger than she had realized from her view of it on Friday. In summer, with a water point, it was genuinely usable. What's the filing timeline? Patterson looked at her, and she could see he was still adjusting to her presence at this table as an equal participant rather than an adjacent one. He adjusted without making an issue of it. I'd want to file before the territorial session closes in December, before someone else sees the opportunity. That's 6 weeks, she said. We'd need a survey. I have a man in Millhaven who does survey work. He can be here in 2 weeks. Colton looked at Eliza. She looked back at him. The water point engineering, she said. I know someone in Harlan County who did mine infrastructure work. He's been looking to come west. He'd know the drilling. Patterson's raised an eyebrow slightly. You have mining contacts. My father was a miner. I have mining contacts. She looked at him evenly. Is that a problem? No, he said. It's useful. He looked between them. Do we have an agreement in principle? Colton looked at Eliza again, and she gave him the nod that had developed over the past weeks as their shorthand. For yes. I've considered it. Proceed. Agreement in principle, Colton said. Patterson stood, extended his hand to Colton, shook it, and then extended it to Eliza. She took it. His grip was firm and even the grip of a man acknowledging a peer. After he left, Colton stood at the window, watching him ride out. 2 months ago, I was managing this operation alone, and bleeding money I didn't know was being taken. 2 months ago, Eliza agreed. Now I have a water rights partnership and a solved theft, and a ranch that's financially cleaner than I thought. He turned from the window. And a wife. More or less. More or less, she said, which for them was close to domestic. The consequences moved through Blackstone Valley in waves over the following 2 weeks, the way consequences always do when something that has been hidden becomes visible, each revelation pulling the next one into the light. Whitmore's lawyer arrived from Denver and spent 3 days in town before leaving, without the outcome his client had hoped for. The territorial prosecutor presented with Patterson's testimony, the Hesfeed records, Caswell's witness account from the Ridge, and Eliza's complete documentation of the financial trail, had a case that the Denver lawyer could complicate but could not make disappear. The branded cattle on the Ridge were the central exhibit, 31 head with altered brands, 17 clearly identifiable as Rourke stock, and the branding equipment still present in the saddlebags that Greer had dropped when he ran. Greer, captured at the North Ridge by Patterson and his man, gave a statement that Arden described to Colton as comprehensive and efficiently incriminating, which Eliza interpreted to mean that Greer had decided his best option was to give up Whitmore completely in exchange for whatever consideration the court would offer. Callaway in Millhaven was doing the same. Whitmore, between a brother-in-law and a former associate, both talking to the prosecutor, had very little left to manage except the size of the eventual judgment. Dex Harlan entered a separate proceeding. His cooperation had begun on the Ridge when he didn't run, and it continued through his interview with Arden and the territorial marshal. His statement was specific and accurate about Greer's role and Whitmore's involvement, and Arden told Colton privately that Dex had given them several pieces of evidence they hadn't had. What Dex would ultimately receive in return for this was something Eliza didn't know yet and held herself from speculating about too precisely because the parts of justice she couldn't control were the parts she had learned to put down before they consumed her attention. What she could control was the ranch, and she continued to control it. The drainage problem on the west wall turned out to require more intervention than she had estimated, and she spent 4 days working with Petey on a redirect channel that would pull the groundwater away from the foundation before the heavy winter weather drove it deeper. It was unglamorous work involving a significant amount of mud and 2 tools that weren't quite right for the job, and they managed it anyway. Nora came by on Wednesday of the second week with her father. Elias Hess was a compact, deliberate man in his 60s who looked like someone who had spent 40 years doing physical work and had made his peace with exactly who that had made him. He shook Eliza's hand and thanked her without excess, and then talked with Colton about feed supply for the coming winter with the efficiency of a business conversation between 2 people who respect each other's time. When the men had drifted toward the barn to discuss something about the hay delivery schedule, Nora sat across from Eliza at the kitchen table and exhaled. "My father hasn't shaken a Rourke hand in 3 years," she said. Whitmore told him Colton had spoken against the Hess operation to the county assessor. "We couldn't prove it was a lie, but it didn't feel right." She paused. "It was a lie." Whitmore spent a long time making sure nobody in this valley talked to anybody else long enough to compare notes, Eliza said. "And you came in from outside and talked to everybody." Nora looked at her with the directness that Eliza had learned to read as affection. "You had no reason to. You didn't know any of us. You'd been mocked and snubbed and gone at sideways before you'd been here a week." "I had reasons," Eliza said. "What reasons?" Eliza considered this. The accounts needed organizing. The accounts turned up the theft. The theft pointed at people in the valley. Once you know a thing, you can't decide not to know it. She paused. And the people here, the ones who weren't Whitmore, the ones who'd been managed and squeezed and kept separate from each other, they deserved to have someone look at what was actually happening. She looked at Nora. "You told me on our first walk that Margaret Holt didn't speak for everybody here. That was a real thing to say to a stranger. It cost you something to say it." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Not that much." "More than nothing," Eliza said. They sat together in the way they had learned to sit, without needing to fill every space. Margaret Holt did not come to the ranch. She was not the kind of woman who went to places that implied a concession, and Eliza did not expect her to. But Adeline Marsh came on a Thursday afternoon 2 weeks after the arrests, with a basket of preserves that she set on the porch with the self-consciousness of someone who has rehearsed this visit and is now finding the rehearsal was insufficient. Eliza stood in the doorway and looked at the basket and looked at Adeline. I wanted to Adeline started and stopped and tried again. The things I said at the post office were, "You were relaying someone else's position," Eliza said. "You've been doing that for a while. I understand how it works." Adeline looked at her with the expression of someone who is both relieved at being understood and uncomfortable at being understood quite that specifically. She's not a bad person. I know she's not a bad person, Eliza said. Most people who do unkind things aren't bad people. They're people who haven't had anyone push back on them in long enough that they've stopped thinking about the effect. She looked at Adeline steadily. That's not an excuse. It's just a description. Adeline pressed her lips together. You could have made things very difficult for people who weren't kind to you. I didn't come here to make things difficult, Eliza said. I came here to work. I know that now. She gestured at the basket. These are peach preserves. From my kitchen, I made them myself. Eliza looked at the basket. Then she stepped back from the doorway. Come in, I'll make coffee. Adeline came in. She sat at the kitchen table with the careful posture of someone who is not sure of their welcome and is trying not to presume, which was, Eliza thought, a better version of Adeline than the one who had appeared at the post office with Margaret Holt's social agenda in her hands. They drank coffee and talked about the coming winter and the drainage work Eliza had been doing, and it was not easy and not warm exactly, but it was real, and real was enough for a start. The letter from Nevada arrived on a Friday, 3 weeks after the arrests. It was in Cal's handwriting. She recognized it from across the room when the postmaster handed it to her, recognized the particular way he formed his capital letters, the slight leftward lean of his script that he had never entirely corrected. She walked out of the post office and stood on the main street of Blackstone Valley, with the letter in her hands for a long moment before she opened it. He was alive. He was in a mining camp outside Carson City. He had been ill. The letter was vague about what kind of ill, and she read between the vagueness to understand it had been serious. And he was recovered now, or mostly recovered. And he had written 6 months ago to her last Kentucky address, and the letter had come back. And he had only just found out through a county record search that she was no longer in Harlan County. He had heard she had gone west. He had heard she had married a rancher in Colorado Territory. He wrote, I always knew you'd end up somewhere that had to be persuaded you belonged. You never could resist a place that didn't want to take you seriously. She stood on the main street of Blackstone Valley with the letter in her hand and the October wind doing what October wind does, which is remind you that the world is large and time is specific, and some things you have been carrying alone can be set down. She didn't cry. She was not a person who cried easily or often, and she had her mother's voice in her head about composure in public spaces, and she was on a main street. But her eyes were bright enough that when Nora happened to come out of the general store at that exact moment and looked at her, Nora stopped and said simply, Good news or bad news? Good, Eliza said. Her voice was slightly rough. Very good. Nora looked at her for a moment. Then she said, Come on. I'll buy you a piece of pie at the hotel, and you can tell me about it. They walked down the street together. Two women who had found each other in the way that sometimes happens on the frontier, not by design, not by obvious similarity, but by the specific gravity of people who are honest about things, which draws them together across whatever other distances exist. The letter was in Eliza's coat pocket. Against her chest, through 2 layers of wool, she could feel its particular weight, which was not the weight of paper, but the weight of a connection she had thought she might have lost for good, returning. She was not a person given to dramatic statements about what things meant. But she thought, walking down that street with the mountains at the end of it, and the wind in her face and the letter against her chest, that this valley which had greeted her with contempt and had turned out to be full of more complexity and more people worth knowing than she had allowed herself to expect, had given her back something she had stopped hoping for. She didn't say this to Nora. She ordered her coffee and her pie and told her about Cal, and Nora listened, the way Nora listened, which was completely and without interruption, and that was enough. Cal arrived in Blackstone Valley on a Tuesday, in the first week of December, coming off the afternoon stage with a coat that was too thin for Colorado winter, and a grin that was exactly as she remembered it, lopsided, slightly apologetic. carrying within it the particular energy of a man who has survived something serious and has not yet entirely processed the fact of his survival. Eliza was at the stage stop because she had known which coach he would be on. His second letter, written after hers had reached him in Carson City, had given her the date and the route and a postscript that said, "Don't make a fuss." She had made no fuss. She was simply standing there when the coach door opened, holding her coat closed against the wind, watching the passengers come down. He saw her before she moved. He stopped on the step, with one foot on the ground and one still on the coachboard, and looked at her for a moment with an expression that was doing several things at once: relief and something older than relief. The particular complicated emotion of siblings who have been through the same hard beginning and have ended up in different places and are now looking at each other from across that distance. Then he stepped down and crossed the gap and hugged her, which was something they had not done easily even when they were children, because their family had not been built for easy expression, and so it was brief and fierce and slightly awkward and entirely real. "You look different," he said, stepping back to look at her. "I've been working outside for 2 months. Not that." He studied her with the assessment of someone who has known a person their whole life and reads changes that have nothing to do with surface. "You look like you're somewhere you intended to be." She looked at him. He was thinner than she had last seen him, 2 years ago in Kentucky before he went west, and there was something in the way he held himself that suggested the illness had not finished leaving him yet, though it was clearly retreating. His eyes were the same their mother's eyes, gray and direct and slightly impatient with anything that wasn't getting to the point. "Come on," she said. "Colton's at the ranch. You can eat something. Always your version of welcome." But he picked up his bag and fell in beside her with the ease of two people who, whatever else has changed, still know the rhythm of walking together. The meeting between Cal Vane and Colton Rourke went approximately as Eliza had predicted, which was to say it went through an initial period of two men taking each other's measure with the careful efficiency of people who are each trying to determine whether the other is worth trusting, followed by a conversation about ranch infrastructure that lasted 40 minutes and in which both of them forgot to be guarded because the subject matter was more interesting than the performance. Cal had done mineshaft engineering in Nevada. The work involved drainage, load-bearing calculations, water management in difficult terrain, and the precise kind of structural problem-solving that Colton had been facing on the ranch's west wall and the creek-adjacent fence lines. By the time Eliza cleared the dinner plates, they were at the table with the ranch maps spread between them, and Cal was sketching a drainage solution in the margin that was different from what Eliza had rigged in October and almost certainly better. She stood at the sink and listened to them and felt something she had no clean name for, something in the vicinity of complete, which was a feeling she associated with very few moments in her life, and which she received with the wariness of someone who has learned that complete is usually temporary, and the recognition of it is, therefore, worth slowing down for. Cal stayed 3 days that first visit. He slept in the spare room and ate at their table and walked the fence lines with Colton in the mornings and went over the drainage sketches with Eliza in the evenings. On his last morning, he sat across from her at the kitchen table before Colton was up and said, without preamble, "He's a good man." "I know," she said. "He doesn't say much. Neither do you." "I say plenty." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He had their father's hands broad across the knuckles, built for physical work. She had always thought they were better suited to that than her own, though her own had managed. "Are you happy?" She looked at him. Question was one she had not asked herself in exactly those terms, because happiness was a word that had always seemed too large and too approximate for the things she actually felt, which were more specific, satisfied, grounded, useful, occasionally and unexpectedly moved by something she hadn't anticipated. Whether those things added up to happy depended on what you meant by the word. "Yes," she said, "I think so. In the way I know how to be." He nodded. He understood the qualifier because he had the same qualifier, the same inheritance of people who expressed contentment practically rather than effusively and trusted actions over declarations. "Good," he said, and that was enough for both of them. Before he left, he told her he was thinking about staying in the territory. There was mine consulting work in the region, and he was done with Nevada, which he described as a place that had tried to kill him and nearly succeeded, and that he was therefore finished being loyal to. She told him there was a room at the ranch if he needed it, while he established himself. He said he'd think about it, which meant yes. She watched the stage carry him back toward the Territory Road and felt the particular bittersweet quality of a reunion that has confirmed something you needed confirmed, but has not yet resolved into permanence. He would come back. She was certain of that, the way she was certain of things. She couldn't fully explain the same instinct that had told her, reading Colton's advertisement in the Harlan County Post Office, that this was a real chance rather than a desperate one. She turned and walked back to the ranch, because there was still the morning work, and the morning work did not wait for sentiment. The territorial court convened in the county seat in the second week of December, and the Whitmore proceedings occupied 3 days of it. Eliza attended one day. Colton attended all 3. Patterson attended the first and last, which told its own story about what he considered most important, the establishment of the charges and the final judgment. The courtroom was a plain building with good acoustics and insufficient heat, which meant that the gallery audience kept their coats on, and the proceedings had the quality of a conversation conducted at a slight disadvantage by everyone involved. The prosecutor was a careful man from the territorial office who had done his preparation and showed it. Whitmore's Denver lawyer was skilled and expensive and operated on the theory that enough procedural complexity could reshape the meaning of clear evidence, which was a theory the territorial judge, a woman of 60 who had been on the bench for 11 years and had seen the theory deployed many times, did not find persuasive. The altered brands were entered as evidence. The Hess feed records were entered. Eliza's financial documentation, the complete chain from the hidden Rourke records through the Creekside grazing registration to the Millhaven sale, was entered. Caswell testified about what he had witnessed on the ridge. Patterson testified about the water rights pressure and the fence incidents. Calloway, the brother-in-law, testified under his cooperation arrangement with a thoroughness that suggested a man who had decided his best future lay in being more useful than his former associate. Greer testified last among the cooperating witnesses. He was methodical and specific, and gave the court a complete operational picture of how the cattle had been selected, moved, altered, and sold. He named dates, quantities, prices, and the people present at each stage. By the end of his testimony, Whitmore's lawyer had stopped taking notes, which Eliza read as a professional acknowledgement that the case was where it was. She sat in the gallery and watched Whitmore across the courtroom. He was composed in the way that men who have controlled things for a long time are composed when they can feel the control, leaving a kind of frozen quality, the dignity of someone who has decided that the only thing left to manage is the performance of bearing it. She did not feel triumphant watching him. She felt the flat, clear satisfaction of a correct calculation, the same feeling she had when the account books finally balanced, when the numbers came out to what they should be. Claude Whitmore was convicted on 4 counts, including cattle theft at scale, fraudulent land registration, and the use of coercive methods against neighboring operations. The judge sentenced him with the economy of someone who had made a decision long before the proceedings concluded, and was simply now stating it. The Creekside Grazing Company registration was voided. The Callaway land claim was suspended pending review. The cattle on the ridge were remanded to the Rourke operation upon verification of the original brands. Dex Harlins received a reduced sentence reflecting his cooperation and his decision not to flee. The judge noted in her statement that the difference between a man who runs and a man who stands and takes the consequences is not nothing, and that it would be accounted for. Eliza did not know whether this was justice exactly. She thought it was something close to it, the imperfect, functional version that actual courts produced, rather than the clean version that existed in principle. She had made her peace with the gap between those two things some years ago. On the way out of the courthouse, Arden stopped her briefly in the hallway. "Your documentation made this case prosecutable," he said. "The witness testimony gave us the picture, but what you put together gave us the framework the picture had to fit inside. The records were already there," she said. "I just organized them." He looked at her with the expression she had first seen at the kitchen table when he had said, "Your documentation was careful work." "You keep saying things like that," he observed. "Because they're true." "Yes," he said, "and also because you don't want to make a claim that invites a challenge." He put his hat on. "You should know the claim would hold up." He walked away. She stood in the courthouse hallway for a moment. With that thought, which was perhaps the most direct acknowledgement she had received from someone with no personal stake in acknowledging it, and felt it settle into whatever internal account she kept of things that had been established beyond reasonable argument. The Joint Range claim filed by Rourke and Patterson was approved by the Territorial Land Office in the third week of December. The survey had been completed in 2 weeks by Patterson's man, and the filing had gone through with the clean documentary trail that Eliza had prepared, no ambiguities, no gaps, no provisions that could be read in two directions. Patterson came to the ranch the day the approval notice arrived, not because the business required it, but because he was, under the measured exterior, a man who marked things, and this was something worth marking. He and Colton shook hands on the porch in the cold December afternoon, and Eliza stood in the doorway and watched them, and thought about the specific shape of how things change, not in dramatic reversals, but in accumulated small decisions, each one shifting the ground slightly, until one day you look up and you are standing somewhere entirely different from where you started. "Bring survey for the water point," Patterson said. "I have a man who can do the engineering," Colton said. He glanced at Eliza. "Possibly. Definitely," she said. "He'll be in the territory by February." Patterson looked between them. "Your brother?" "He did mine shaft water management in Nevada for 2 years," she said. "A ridge water point is simpler." Patterson nodded. He had, over the past weeks, made adjustments in how he spoke to Eliza that she had noticed and appreciated without drawing attention to less of the unconscious addressing of Colton when the question was hers, more of the direct engagement that acknowledged she was a participant rather than a context. It was not a complete transformation, but it was genuine movement, which was more valuable than a performed transformation would have been. "There's one more thing," Patterson said. He reached into his coat and produced a letter. "This came to me because I'm on the County Agricultural Committee. It's from the Territorial Land Commissioner's Office. They're establishing a regional records review board looking at land and water rights filings across the territory for procedural irregularities. In the wake of the Whitmore case," he held out the letter. "They're looking for someone with demonstrated competence in financial and land record analysis to serve as a civilian reviewer." He was holding the letter toward Eliza, not Colton. She took it. "Read it." The language was official and careful, the way territorial communications always were, but the substance was clear: a paid, formal appointment to review county-level records for the kind of irregularities that the Whitmore operation had exploited. Quarterly sessions in the county seat, access to official files, a stipend that was modest but real. "They heard about what you put together," Patterson said. The prosecutor mentioned it to the commissioner in his post-trial report. She looked up from the letter. Colton was watching her with an expression that she had learned meant he had already formed his position and was waiting for her to form hers, because he was not a man who led with his opinions when the decision primarily belonged to someone else. "This is a formal appointment," she said. "It is. I'd be reviewing records across multiple counties. Not just this one." "That's correct." She looked at the letter again. The instinct was the same instinct that had recognized value in Colton's advertisement, the recognition of a thing that was right in its specifics, that asked from her what she was actually capable of giving, rather than what people generally assumed she could give. She had spent her adult life in the gap between those two things. This letter was written for the first column, not the second. "I'll need to discuss the schedule with Colton," she said. "Quarterly sessions I'd need to be away from the ranch for stretches." "We can manage the ranch," Colton said. His voice was even. He had already decided. She had known he would. She looked at Patterson. "Tell the commissioner yes." Patterson took the letter back to return, with her formal acceptance. He stayed for coffee and left before dark, riding back through the December cold, with the efficiency of a man who has accomplished what he came to do and has other things waiting. After he was gone, Colton stood at the window the way he stood when he was thinking through something he wasn't ready to say yet. She let him have the time. She had learned the geography of his interior process and where to stand in relation to it. "Records reviewer for the Territorial Land Office," he said, finally. "Civilian reviewer," she said. "Quarterly. You'll be good at it." "I know." He turned from the window. There was something in his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same country a warmth that she had come to recognize as his variety of it, quieter than most people's and more reliable for that reason. "When I put that advertisement out, He said, I wrote that I needed someone capable. I remember. I had a specific idea of what capable meant. Managing a household. Keeping accounts. Not being afraid of hard work. He looked at her steadily. I did not have in my idea of capable. Uncovers 3-year theft operation. Builds criminal case. Saves 31 cattle on a ridge in winter. And gets appointed by the Territorial Land Office. The appointment is new, she said. The rest was just the work. Stop doing that, he said. She looked at him. Stop reducing it. His voice was not harsh, it was direct, which was different. You do that with everything you do. You make it smaller than it is. You've been doing it since the day you got here. He held her gaze. I've been watching you organize this valley back into something functional and take no credit for any of it. And I understand why you do it. You've been in rooms where claiming things got you attacked, so you learned not to claim, but you're not in those rooms anymore. She was quiet for a moment. The lamp was burning on the table, and the December dark was outside the windows, and the ranch was all around them in its ordinary evening sounds. Old habits, she said. Yes, he said. I know about those. She looked at him. He was not a man who talked about himself easily, and when he said something like that, it carried the weight of what he was not also saying, 4 years of managing alone, of contracting to take up as little space as possible, of running an operation in a kind of emotional minimalism that had kept him functional and also kept him from rebuilding anything beyond function. We're both working on it, she said. Yes, he said. We are. Christmas came to Blackstone Valley with the pragmatic modesty of a frontier celebration, not elaborate, not poor, just the particular warmth that communities generate in the cold months when the distance between people becomes something to push against rather than accept. Nora's family hosted a gathering that included the Rourke household, 2 of the Colhurst family members, a neighboring homesteader family named Bright, who had not been part of the valley's social architecture before, but whom Nora had included with the specific intention of expanding what the architecture could hold. Eliza brought the peach preserves that Adeline Marsh had given her, made into a dessert she had worked out over 2 attempts, which was honest about having required 2 attempts. Adeline was there. She had come without Margaret Holt, who had sent her regrets through a note that was polite and slightly stiff, the note of someone who has not fully decided yet whether revision is required. Eliza had no investment in the timeline of that decision. People moved at the pace they moved, and trying to accelerate someone else's reckoning was generally more trouble than it was worth. The gathering had the quality of something new, finding its shape not the old social order of the valley, where position and wealth structured every room, but something looser and more honest, people talking across the lines that Whitmore's careful management had kept between them. Eliza sat beside Nora at one point and watched Colton talking to Elias Hess, the 2 of them in the corner of the room, with the ease of a conversation that had moved past the business stage into the territory of 2 men who have decided they respect each other. Your father seems comfortable, she said to Nora. He's been coming out of it slowly. Nora watched him too. He's been carrying the barn fire for 3 years. Knowing it was Whitmore, knowing it's been accounted for, I can see him putting it down. She paused. It doesn't happen fast. Some things you carry for so long that even when you don't have to carry them anymore, your hands don't know how to let go. Eliza thought about her brother, about the letters that had stopped coming, and the year she had spent not knowing, and the specific adjustment she had made in that year, the decision to stop waiting for the information and to fill the absent assumption of the best available outcome, because the alternative was to let the not knowing hollow her out. It had been a discipline, not a feeling. She had chosen it the way you choose a tool for a specific job, not because it was easy, but because it was the right implement for what she needed to accomplish. You learn to carry things differently, she said. Not lighter exactly, just more efficiently, so they take less of you. Nora looked at her. Is that what you did? When you lost your mother and Cal went silent and everything came apart at once. I didn't have an alternative, Eliza said. Falling apart takes resources I didn't have. So I didn't. She paused. That's not admirable, by the way. It's just what survival looks like in practice. It's not the same as being strong. What is it then? Eliza thought about it. Being stubborn about the future tense, she said finally. Insisting that there will be a later and that you'll be in it. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then I want to write that down. Don't. It'll sound more profound written down than it deserves to. Nora laughed, a real laugh. The sudden kind and the sound of it moved through the room, and people turned toward it reflexively. The way people always turn toward genuine laughter in a warm room in winter, because it is one of the few sounds that is entirely without threat. Colton across the room looked at Eliza when he heard it. She caught his eye. He looked at her for a moment with that particular quality of attention she had learned was his version of saying something. And she held the look briefly and looked away. And that was enough. That was exactly their kind of enough. January settled the valley under the kind of cold that is not dramatic, but simply relentless, the cold that gets into the buildings and the bones and the ground and does not leave for months. The ranch work contracted to its essential form, the stripped-down winter version where everything unnecessary had been cut away, and what remained was what had to be done regardless of weather or mood or difficulty. Eliza worked the winter version of the accounts alongside the winter version of the ranch, which meant auditing the previous year's full record now that the theft losses had been properly documented and the inflated supplier costs corrected. She sent a formal letter to the Millhaven supplier, noting the pricing discrepancy, attaching the evidence, and requesting reimbursement for 18 months of overcharges. The letter was polite and specific and included a calculation of the total amount owed. She received a response in 2 weeks that was apologetic in tone and included a bank draft for the full amount, which told her that whoever ran that operation had a lawyer who had looked at her documentation and concluded that contesting it was not worth the exposure. She put the bank draft in the ranch account and noted it in the ledger under the heading, Recovered Overcharges, which she felt was accurate and sufficient. Petey had been quieter since Dex left. Not withdrawn exactly, he still worked with the same willing efficiency, still talked when talked to, but there was an adjustment happening in him that she recognized as the particular recalibration of a young person who has discovered that someone they looked up to was not who they thought. Dex had been, in many ways, Petey's primary model for how to operate on a working ranch, and the discovery of what Dex had been doing did not erase the competence he had learned from him, but it complicated it. She left him to the adjustment for the first few weeks, and then, one morning in late January when they were working together on the trough heating system that the storm had damaged and Cal's redesign had improved, she said, without looking up from the pipe fitting, "You can learn a real skill from a person who has character problems. The skill doesn't become wrong because the person was." Petey was quiet for a moment. "I know that, do you?" He thought about it honestly, which was something she appreciated about him. He didn't reach for the easy answer. "I know it in my head," he said. "It's taking a while to know it the other way." "That's fair," she said. "It took me a while too, after certain people." He looked at her. "Who, the logging camp manager? Who taught me to keep supply records?" He was meticulous about the work, and he shortchanged his workers on pay every season. She kept her hands moving on the fitting. "I learned the record keeping. I also learned what it looks like when someone uses precision as cover for dishonesty. Both things were useful." Petey was quiet for a while longer. Then Mrs. Rourke. She had not quite gotten used to being called that yet. She suspected she would not get used to it for some time, which was fine. She had never been in a hurry to normalize things that deserved to be noticed. "Yes, I'm glad you came here." She looked at him. He was 19 years old and sincere in the unguarded way of someone who has not yet learned to protect sincerity by keeping it private, and she thought that the frontier would probably teach him that eventually, which was a loss as well as a lesson. "So am I," she said. They went back to the pipe fitting. Cal arrived in February, as she had said he would, with a properly weighted coat this time, and a crate of engineering tools, and a slightly improved version of himself, the illness further back, the energy more sustained, the grin still lopsided but less apologetic about it. He moved into the spare room not as a visitor, but as a resident, which required a brief conversation about terms that was so direct and practical that it was over in 10 minutes. He would contribute to the household work and pay a nominal board until his consulting work established itself. He would help with the Ridge water point in spring. He would not rearrange the kitchen because he had learned as a child that rearranging Eliza's systems without permission was a category of error with specific consequences. This last point he stated himself, which made Colton, who was present for this conversation, produce the distant relative of a smile that Eliza had come to collect privately like stamps. Cal and Colton settled into the particular easy-difficult dynamic of two self-contained men sharing domestic space, which involved a period of adjustment followed by a functional equilibrium that was not warm exactly, but was solid and mutually respectful in the specific way of people who have determined that the other person does not waste words, or energy, which is the frontier version of a compliment. Cal started his consulting work in March, riding out to neighboring operations and to mining sites in the wider region with the methodical competence of someone who has something real to offer and knows it without making a production of knowing it. He sent his first payment home to a boarding house address in Harlan County where an elderly woman named Mrs. Crane had been the last person to know their mother, a gesture so characteristic of him that when Eliza found out about it, she had to take a minute in the supply room to collect herself. She did not tell him she knew. He would not have wanted her to. They were the same that way. Spring came to Blackstone Valley in the particular Colorado fashion, hesitant, cold, retreating twice before it actually arrived, and with it came the work of the range. The Northeast Ridge Water Point was surveyed in April and constructed in May, a 6-week project that involved Colton, Patterson's men, Cal's engineering, and 2 hired hands from the county seat who knew drilling. Eliza managed the supply chain for the construction, which meant coordinating deliveries across a 6-week timeline on terrain that was difficult for wagons and required a specific sequencing of materials that she worked out in the first week and adjusted twice as conditions changed. When the water point was operational, a stone-lined basin, fed by a drilled well at the flat's natural water table, with a gravity-fed trough system extending to the grazing area. Patterson and Colton stood at the edge of the flat where Eliza had crouched behind the rock outcrop in October and looked at the valley below. "My father ranched this territory for 20 years, Patterson said. He always said the Northeast Ridge was usable, but nobody ever made the investment to use it." He was quiet for a moment. He would have liked this. Colton didn't say anything, which was the right response. Eliza, standing slightly to their left, looked at the valley below and tried to match it to what she had seen in October, the same geography, the same mountains, a different light. The valley looked smaller from up here and also more comprehensible, the way things do when you can see their whole shape. She could see the Rourke Ranch from this distance, a precise arrangement of buildings and fence lines, and the thin thread of the creek that she had been managing one way or another for 7 months. She had arrived here with 31 cents and a worn suitcase. What she had now was not wealth in the way that Margaret Holt counted wealth. It was something less countable and harder to take away a ranch that ran honestly, a husband who saw her clearly, a brother within riding distance, a friendship with a woman who was worth knowing, a formal appointment that acknowledged what she could do, and the specific satisfaction of a community that had been partially repaired through the simple act of refusing to stay quiet, when quiet was the wrong choice. None of it had arrived without cost. She had been cold and frightened on that ridge in October in ways she had not mentioned to anyone. She had made errors in the investigation, 2 assumptions that had turned out to be wrong in detail if not in direction, which had cost her 3 days of recalculation. She had misjudged Dex's capacity for regret, which didn't change the outcome, but had complicated her feelings about it. She was still working on the habit of reducing her own contributions, which Colton had named accurately, and which she had been conscious of since with imperfect results. She was not a transformed woman. She was the same woman she had always been, which was someone stubborn about the future tense, working on the same problems she had always worked on, in a place that had turned out to be worth the difficulty of arriving. The Territorial Records Review Board convened its first session in June. Eliza rode to the county seat, with Colton driving the wagon he had offered, and she had accepted it, and they had agreed without discussing it that he would come back for her at the end of the 3-day session. The board was 5 people, a retired judge, 2 land office officials, a representative from the Territorial Agricultural Committee, and Eliza. She was the youngest person in the room, and the only woman and the only one without a formal professional title. She was also, she discovered within the first 2 hours, the one who had done the most thorough preparation of the current review files, which she had requested and received 3 weeks before the session, and had organized into a working system that the others adopted without formal discussion, because it was clearly the right system. Retired judge, a man named Archibald, who was 70, and had the particular authority of someone who has been right, often enough to have stopped needing to perform being right. Spent the first session watching her work. On the second day, he moved to sit beside her at the long review table instead of across from her, and began asking her questions about her methodology, not challenging questions, functional ones, the questions of a man building a working picture. On the third day, he said, during a break, "Where did you train?" "I didn't," she said. "I kept accounts for a boarding house and a logging camp, and then I reorganized a ranch's records and found a 3-year theft inside them." He looked at her. "The Whitmore case." "Yes." I read the prosecutor's report. He was quiet for a moment. "The documentary framework was exceptional. I've seen trained legal clerks do worse." "The records were already there," she said, and then stopped. Because she had promised herself she was working on that habit. She started again. "I organized them into a structure that made the pattern visible," she said. The pattern was always there. I just made it readable. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has just gotten a more accurate answer than the first one. "That's the work," he said. "That's exactly the work." She held his gaze and did not reduce it further. "I know," she said. She came home from the county seat to a ranch that smelled of summer and cooking and the particular warmth of a place that has been lived in with intention. Colton was on the porch when the wagon came up the road, standing in the late afternoon light, with his arms crossed and his hat off a posture she had come to read as his version of watching for something, which was itself a version of caring about something, which was Colton's circuitous route to most things that mattered to him. She climbed down from the wagon before he came to help, because she was capable of climbing down from a wagon, and he had long since stopped making a point of offering what she didn't need. She handed him the field bag and walked beside him to the porch. "How was it?" he said. "Productive," she said. "We flagged 11 filings across 4 counties for further review. 3 of them look significant." She paused. "The retired judge wants to propose expanding the boards to include annual sessions. Will they fund it? Probably. The Whitmore case gave the territorial office enough embarrassment that they're motivated to demonstrate they're taking records integrity seriously." She sat on the porch step. The judge also said something about a formal appointment, rather than a civilian review position. More authority, more responsibility, quarterly plus annual. A real salary. Colton sat beside her. Not close. Not performing closeness, just beside her in the easy way of 2 people who have become genuinely comfortable with each other's physical proximity, which was something she had not expected to have, and had come to value with the particular intensity of someone who knows what its absence feels like. "Do you want it?" he said. "Yes," she said without hesitation. He nodded. "Then take it." She looked at him. The evening was coming in over the mountains with the gold and gray of a Colorado summer dusk, and the cattle were moving in the far pasture, and Cal was coming out of the barn with the easy walk of someone who has found his footing in a new place. And somewhere inside the house, Nora was in the kitchen. She had been helping with a canning project and had apparently gotten absorbed in it, because the smell of vinegar and apple was drifting through the open window. It was not a perfect picture. It was better than that. It was the kind of ordinary that takes years of work to build, and that looks simple from the outside in the way that anything competently constructed looks simple, because the effort is in the structure, and the structure is invisible when it holds. "I want to tell you something," she said. Colton waited. "When I answered that advertisement, I told myself I was making a practical decision. Calculation about options and odds." She was looking at the far pasture, at Cal's silhouette against the evening. "I was not expecting this. What were you expecting?" "Function," she said. "The kind of life where you keep the important things running and you don't ask for more than that, because asking for more is where you get hurt." She paused. "I've been asking for more than that every day since I got here, without deciding to. Just happened in the course of the work." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, is that all right?" She looked at him. Colton Rourke, who had lived 4 years in the narrow functional version of his own life and had also, in the course of the work, ended up somewhere larger than that, who did not perform his feelings, but carried them with a consistency that was more reliable than performance ever was, who had stepped forward in a crowded room and said, without calculation, "No one insults my future wife," and had meant it in a way that had nothing to do with audience and everything to do with the specific, stubborn conviction that some things are simply not acceptable regardless of the social cost. "Yes," she said. "It's all right." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached out and covered her hand with his, not dramatically, not gesturally. The way you reach for something you have decided belongs within your reach. She turned her hand and held his, and they sat like that on the porch in the summer evening, while Cal whistled something tuneless crossing the yard, and the smell of Nora's cannings came through May Mountain, came through the window, and the mountains held their position at the edge of everything the way they always did, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small human drama below them, which was in its ways the right backdrop for a life being built. Not the mountains caring, not the frontier softening, just the work continuing, and two people doing it together, and the particular stubborn insistence on being present in whatever came next. This is what the frontier teaches, if it teaches anything, that belonging is not something you are granted. It is something you make with your hands and your hours and your willingness to look at a difficult thing directly and not flinch. That the people who judge you by what you carry when you arrive are seeing the thinnest possible version of the truth, and that the rest of the truth reveals itself only through time and action, and the kind of character that cannot be performed convincingly enough to fool anyone who is actually paying attention. Eliza Vane had arrived in Blackstone Valley with 31 cents and a worn suitcase, and the weight of everything she had survived, and a mind sharp enough to cut through 3 years of deliberate obscurement without formal training or official standing. She had not arrived looking for validation from people who had already decided she wasn't worth their respect. She had arrived because it was the next right thing, and she had stayed because the work was real, and the people were worth it, and she was underneath the efficiency and the habit of reduction. Someone who had always believed that a life could be built if you were willing to do the actual building. The girl who had stood on the main street of Blackstone Valley in a dusty dress, holding a worn suitcase in both hands while people laughed, had not transformed into someone different. She had simply stayed who she was long enough for the truth of it to become undeniable. That is not a small thing. In a world that regularly mistakes surface for substance and is often very slow to correct itself, staying who you are against the pressure to be less than that is its own form of courage, quiet and unglamorous and worth considerably more than most people give it credit for. She sat on the porch in the summer evening and held Colton's hand and let the ordinary goodness of it be enough, because it was enough, because she had learned the hard way that enough, real enough, built carefully and honestly from whatever materials you actually have, is the thing that lasts.